I was having a lousy day. It started when the boss chewed me out in front of the whole office for a mistake that I had made on one of the accounts. A client had been overbilled and was using that as a reason not to pay anything. It was stupid and it should not have been a big deal. I mean, it wasn't like anybody was going to die. But that was Mackenzie & Co. advertising agency all over. It was a hothouse of clashing egos, backstabbing and pointing the finger of blame when something went wrong. I was an easy target. It wasn't the first mistake that I had made recently, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. Failure breeds failure just as surely as success follows hot on the heels of success. After the boss had finished telling me what a deadbeat I was, I went out to get a breath of fresh air, just for a couple of minutes while my cheeks stopped burning. I was standing in the little square out front of the office block, taking calming breaths when I felt something strike my shoulder. Something wet and white and disgusting. The bird that had unloaded on my shoulder shrieked and took off from its perch on a window ledge above me. Swearing under my breath, I went to the restroom in the reception area in the hope that I wouldn't bump into any of my colleagues, and spent 20 minutes trying to clean the mess off my shirt. When I got back to my desk, I had 6 missed calls, dozens of new emails, and Peterson in the next booth over looking at me with a contemptuous grin on his face. The day did not improve after this. I drank so much coffee that I got the shakes. I ate an overpriced sandwich at my desk and ended up with fiery indigestion. I sent a visual to the printers that had not been signed off by the client and didn't realize my mistake until it was too late. The copy that I wrote for a new campaign seemed good until Peterson pointed out that it made no sense. I was convinced as well that my suit still smelled like bird crap too. By the time that I finally left the office, my nerves were shredded and I was utterly exhausted. Living the dream, I thought, trying to summon up a smile, but I had nothing. Eyes downcast, feeling older than my 25-year-old self, I set off walking for the train station. Working from home was not permitted by my employer because the boss liked to crack the whip in person, so I had a soul-destroying commute between my home and a distant suburb of the city and the office every day. It was cruel but not unusual. There were countless commuters like me working in the city. We had all had big dreams until reality hit. As I trapezed into the train station, my only ambition was getting back to my bed. I would sleep the sleep of the dead as soon as my head hit the pillow. The platform my train departed from was at the far end of the station. Peak rush hour was over, but there was still plenty of other frazzled-looking commuters on the concourse. A couple of bored-looking uniformed cops were doing a walkthrough as well, nodding now and then as they passed a station employee. There was a row of food stalls, but I ignored them. I couldn't have faced another coffee anyway, and my guts were still churning with indigestion even though I'd eaten nothing since lunch. I carried on until I reached the platform for my train. There were already a couple of dozen people waiting. Some had headphones on. One woman who was around the same age as me wore a fashionable brand that I would have loved to have been able to afford. And almost everybody, as usual, was engrossed in their phones. One haggard-looking man was not, though. He was just staring off into space. He wore a creased, gray suit, and his tie hung at an angle behind a laminated photo ID badge on a lanyard, and years of stress were etched into his face. I feel for your brother, I thought, and then buried my hands in my pockets and waited for the train. 10 minutes later, it pulled into view at its scheduled time. After so many delays and cancellations in the last few months, I was feeling relieved that I was not late as I got on board, and I began to weave through the other passengers looking for a free seat. There was one to my left with plenty of legroom. I beat a harried-looking businesswoman to it and claimed my place. It felt like the first victory that I had had all day. I shuffled around on my backside, trying to get comfy on the hard train seat, sat back, closed my eyes, and tried to relax. But the things that had happened at the office that day were still too raw, and I had a mountain of work waiting for me in the morning. So many problems to untangle. I started to think about an account with an AI startup company. The CEO was an arrogant jerk who kept demanding more and more from me. He was yelling down a video call at me, telling me that I was a loser and that he was going to get me fired. I sat up with a start and I opened my eyes. I had fallen asleep and it had been a stupid dream. I sighed and then noticed the seat next to me was empty. I glanced around. The train had been packed to capacity when it set off, but there were a few more spaces dotted around now. As the train approached its next stop, more passengers rose and headed for the exits. I knew the names of all the stations along the route, and when I saw where we were, I knew there was still an age to go before we made it to my stop. I shuffled again, got as close to comfortable as I was going to get, and I closed my eyes. I suddenly felt like I was falling backwards into a deep dark space, and I threw myself forward to try and stop. Blinking, realizing that I had been falling asleep again, I sat there staring at the window as the world swept by. There were apartment blocks, a drive-through burger joint, cars backed up on a nearby road. Their headlights were on as the sun set on another fruitless day. I shook my head sadly, wrapped my arms around my chest, and closed my eyes again. A minute later, a loud tinny sound made me look up. A teenager a couple of rows down from me was watching a video on his phone at full volume without headphones on. Whatever he was watching involved somebody screeching with laughter. It lasted for a few seconds and then repeated again and again. I counted to 10. Why did this moron have to subject the rest of us to his mindless garbage? The passengers in range of the sound had thinned out even more by now. I had no idea how many people were in the other carriages, but there were only a dozen or so left in mine. The businesswoman who I had beaten in the seat race earlier included. She looked like she was getting ready to leave at the next stop. The woman who had given me headphone envy was further along the carriage as well. Thanks to her high-spec device, she was clearly oblivious to the maddening sound. The haggard-looking man was still on board as well. His eyes were half shut and his head rocked back and forward slightly with the motion of the train. He must have been so tired that he wasn't aware of the noise, I figured, or maybe he had just lost the strength to care. I had earbuds in my suit pocket and I could have put them in and connected to music on my phone, but I knew they weren't good enough to drown out this screeching on repeat. I looked up and down the carriage. I hadn't seen a conductor yet on the train and it seemed likely that there wasn't one. I had read a news article about cutbacks in the city's transportation budget, meaning that a lot of trains would only have drivers and how the unions were protesting. And I hadn't cared until that moment in time. If there had been a conductor, I could have complained to them instead of having to tell the teenager to shut it myself. I was so tired though. This was the last thing that I needed. I decided to leave it to somebody else to speak up and screwed my eyes shut. The noise continued to cut through and I gritted my teeth. And then it started to sound like it was on the move. I opened one eye and saw that the teenager was heading for the door. The train came to a halt, the door slid open and he stepped off. I swore gratefully under my breath. A few more passengers left at the same stop. I watched them drifting down the platform as the train pulled away. It was fully dark outside by now, and once the latest station was out of sight, the only lights that I could see were from the occasional building. There was still a way to go before we reached my distant suburb though, so I sat back once again and tried to relax. Only that still wasn't happening. I needed to go to the bathroom. This was something best avoided on the commuter train that I caught each day. There were restrooms at either end of the train, but they could be horror shows when it came to hygiene. I tried to ignore my bladder, but some things just won't go away. I pushed myself to my feet and walked down to the nearest restroom. Illuminated red letters and a little panel by the door informed me that it was out of order. Typical, I thought, and walked back along the length of the train to see if I would have any more luck with the other one. There were half a dozen carriages and some of them were completely deserted as I passed through them. The others had the odd person dotted here and there. At least there won't be a queue, I thought. And thankfully, the second restroom was in working order and vacant. The smell that greeted me when the door switched open was grim, and there was nowhere that I could put my feet where my shoes wouldn't get wet. I did what I needed to do and I got out of there. I could have sat pretty much anywhere by now, but commuters are creatures of habit and I was no different. And so I returned to what I thought of as my carriage and my seat. Though without thinking that at all, if you know what I mean. The woman with the fabulous headphones was still there, still happily in their noise-canceling embrace as far as I could see. The haggard-looking man was still there as well. I could see the bald spot on the back of his scalp as I approached. That was it for passengers, though. I was the only other person in the carriage. Hoping finally that I could spend the remainder of the journey chilling out, I continued to my seat. But as I passed the haggard-looking man, I noticed that his face was coated in sweat. His neck above his creased collar and crooked tie and photo ID glistened as well, and the two bright electric lights of the train. His skin almost seemed pale, even beneath the sheen of perspiration. I tried to remember if he looked that washed out when I had first seen him, and there was no avoiding the fact that he hadn't. I hesitated. The only things that I knew about medicine came from working on the account of a plastic surgery practice, and it was clear this man didn't need a tummy tucker or liposuction. He appeared to need medical assistance. Still, I just stood there. The man was a complete stranger, and didn't I have enough problems on my own? I told myself. This had nothing to do with me. I started to turn away, but as I did, a low guttural noise started to come out of the man's mouth. It wasn't a snore. It sounded wrong, like there was a serious problem with his breathing. The words death rattle popped into my head. I tried to shake them out of my thoughts and reluctantly figured that I should get involved. "Hey mister, you okay?" I asked. There was no sign that he had heard me. The sound just kept coming from in between his lips, that slow, jarring rattle. Now that I was on this course, I persevered and tried. "Do you want me to get help?" With no conductor and barely any other passengers, I didn't know where I would have gotten help from if he had answered that he would. But once again, there was no response. I paced up and down trying to think. I came to the conclusion that I did need to try and get help regardless, and not from asking if there was a doctor in the train, because the odds of that were way too short. I took out my phone and I dialed 911. It felt like a long time before the call was answered, long enough for the train to make another stop and discard more passengers, and for me to consider hanging up and walking away after all. But then the dispatcher picked up. I answered all their questions, giving them my name and then my location as best as I could based on the train that I was on, the last station that I had seen, and the next one that I knew to be coming up. I described the way the man looked and the sound that he was making, and then the dispatcher asked what the man's name was. I told them that I had no idea, but added that the man had an ID and a lanyard around his neck. I leaned closer so that I could see what it said. The photograph showed the man in better days. There was even the hint of a smile on his lips. His name was printed below the picture, so I read this out to the dispatcher, spelling the surname, and then kept reading the text that followed. It said, "Research Associate, Stoller Institute." After this, the dispatcher asked me to hold for a moment, leaving me listening to a dull buzz, and leaving my mind free to wander. I had never heard of the Stoller Institute, so I had no idea what type of research this fellow spent his days doing. It could have been something dry and academic. Somebody had to research economic trends, I figured. Or it could have been rocket science or even something medical. If only you had taken your turn for the worse while you were still at work, there would be no end of doctors to help out, I thought. Medical or biological. Perhaps he researched what happened when you emptied the contents of test tube A onto sample B. The possibilities were endless, as was this call, it seemed. Finally, there was a click and the dispatcher came back on the line. Only this time it sounded like someone different was speaking when they had asked, "How many people are on the train?" I was thrown off by this and said uncertainly, Me and a lady in this carriage. Maybe a handful more on the rest of the train. No conductor, I think. A driver, though, I guess." There was a pause and a new voice said, "I need you and the female passenger to leave the carriage that you're in and go to the front carriage in the train. Any other passengers that you see are to do the same." I was so thrown off by this that I couldn't speak. "Is that clear?" the voice said. There was an edge to their tone that unsettled me even more. "Yes," I managed to say. "But why? What's wrong?" I was still staring at the man in the seat as I said this, seeing the sweat glint on his pale skin, hearing the rattle of his breath. And I thought of my flight of fancy, of test tube A and sample B, and what might be brewed and breathed in. "Oh," I muttered to myself as much to the voice on the other end of the line, and I asked, "Is he infectious? Is that why you're telling me to get away from him?" There was no reply from the voice on the line. I swallowed. My throat suddenly felt very dry and my skin felt very hot. "What is it?" I asked, the questions tumbling out as panic built inside me. "What has he got?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched on a moment longer and then the voice said, "Leave the carriage that you're in and go to the front carriage. Ensure that everybody else does the same." Not even asking me, but ordering me, and not explaining a thing. I kept staring at the man in the seat in front of me, and I could see a patch of discoloration now in his skin, just below his left eye. It hadn't been there before. It made me think of decay. Still holding the phone to my ear, I began to back away. I stumbled into the edge of a seat, righted myself, and took a few more steps until I was in the eye line of the woman with the designer headphones on. "We have to move," I said to her. She clearly couldn't hear me because of her headphones, but there was no way that she couldn't have seen me, which meant that she was blanking me. I mimed, taking headphones off, and mouthed, "You have to listen to me." She kept blanking me. I didn't get it at first, but then I did. She was a woman on her own late at night on a near-deserted train, and a man she didn't know was in her personal space acting agitated. I took a few more steps away from her, held my palms up, hopefully showing her that I meant no harm. "Please," I said slowly and clearly, "there is a problem." Even though she couldn't hear me, she would be able to lip read. And finally she reacted. She reached into her bag and took out a small canister. "This is mace," she said. "If you don't go away, you're going to get the contents in your eyes. And trust me, buddy, it's gonna hurt." I could have wept even without being maced. I shook my head, waved my hand slowly from side to side in front of my face, trying to make her understand. Drawing out each syllable, I said, "Infectious," and pointed over at her towards the man. She was directing the mace at me but not pressing the release. "Infectious," I said again, and she must have been watching my lips and understood what I was saying, because she lowered the mace and turned to look at the man with a concerned expression on her face. And then she looked at me and swore out loud. She took her headphones off, lowered them till they were around her neck, and got unsteadily to her feet. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know," I replied honestly. I called 911 and the dispatcher saying that we should put distance between ourselves and the man. I didn't add that the dispatcher hadn't confirmed this was because of the danger of infection, or tell her about the edge in their voice. There was something very wrong here, and I wasn't going to hang around for the details. "Come on," I said, and started to walk away on legs that felt hollow. The woman followed without saying anything else. And just before I stepped through the connecting doors into the next carriage, I glanced back at the man. Even from a distance, I could see the discoloration had spread. It looked like a shadow was falling over one half of his face. I shivered and put one foot in front of the other. As we moved through the carriages, I couldn't see any other passengers, Everybody else must have gotten off, I figured, which was good. It meant that I didn't have to persuade any more reluctant strangers to move. A few long minutes later, the woman and I had reached the front carriage. There was a door at the far end which I assumed led to the driver's cabin. I wondered if I should hammer on it to get the driver's attention, or even pull the emergency lever. My head was spinning by now and I just didn't know. And then I remembered that I was still holding my phone. I brought it closer and asked, "Are you still there?" "Yes," the voice replied. "Have you made it to the front carriage?" We have. There's only 2 of us left in the train though. What should we do?" The answer was given straight off this time. "Stay where you are. The Alpha team has been mobilized." I had never heard paramedics or other first responders referred to like that before, but I told myself not to sweat the details. Help was on the way. And even better than that, I had a bright idea. "Hey," I said, down the phone. "There's another stop coming up soon. We can get off there. It'll be safer." I waited for the voice to agree that this was the sensible course of action, but there was no response. The woman had been following my side of the conversation. I smiled in what I hoped was a reassuring way and said, "Just waiting to hear back what they think. They're probably talking to the driver as well and updating the first responders to send them to the station." I was only too eager to fill in the gaps and hurry things along to where somebody else would take care of everything. The woman didn't look convinced though, but the next station was coming up now. I smiled at her, anticipating the train slowing and then pulling to a halt. We could step out into the cool night air. Only the train wasn't slowing. I could see the platform approaching the station name sign and then we were passing it at speed. I didn't understand. "We didn't stop," I cried into the phone. It took me a moment to realize that the line was dead. I looked at the phone dumbly and then looked at the woman. She asked, "What's going on?" I had no idea and I was still thinking what to say when there was an announcement on the train's public address system. "This is the driver. I have been informed there's a medical emergency on board, and we're proceeding direct to the next station where paramedics are waiting." I felt relief flooding through me. Everything was going to be okay. Somebody else was going to take care of things. I grinned goofily at the woman and she smiled back at me. For the first time, I thought how pretty she was. I was single but didn't want to be and wondered if she might give me her phone number if I asked. I was wondering if this was the right moment to ask as the train entered a tunnel. Through the train window, I could see the dark tunnel wall slipping by. And then the train jolted to a halt. I was thrown sideways but managed to stay on my feet. "What the?" I began to exclaim but didn't finish because the inside of the train was suddenly plunged into darkness. I couldn't see a single thing until a small square light appeared. It was illuminating the nervous smile on the woman's face as she held up her phone. She turned the phone's flashlight towards me and said, "Call 911 again." Now I could see my screen, but I put my passcode in, and then cursed and told her, "No signal." She angled her phone back towards herself and stabbed at it with her fingers before saying, "Same here." It was time to get the driver's attention directly. I figured and turned my phone's flashlight on to find the emergency lever. Before I could, the door to the cabin clicked loudly and opened. A bulky figure appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a train company uniform and looked about 60. He had a flashlight as well, a proper one, not just a feature on a phone. He raised the beam and took in the pair of us standing there and asked in a gravelly voice, "Are you folks okay?" Not really, I thought, but I followed the lead of the woman when she started to nod. "Good," he said as he growled in his deep voice. "Well, I'll be honest with you good people. I don't really know what's going on here. First I get the call telling me to hightail it to the next station along so the sick person on board can get medical assistance as soon as possible. And then when I get into the tunnel I see there's a red light, which means that I can't hightail it anywhere. I put the brakes on then and called for an update, but nobody's answering me. It's strange, I tell you, mighty strange. Well, can't you drive on anyway? The woman asked. It surely can't be safe staying here. His wide shoulders shrugged as he responded. There's a red light ahead. It doesn't matter what else is going on. No train driver will ever ignore a red light and continue through it. I don't want my grandkids to see my name on the news as the guy who caused people to lose their lives in a crash. But while I'm waiting for the controllers to pull their fingers out, I figured I should go see if I can help the passenger who's in distress. He raised the first aid box that he held in his other hand so that we could see it. The woman beat me to the draw when she said, "We need to stay away from him, he's infectious." She turned to me and added, "That's right, isn't it? The dispatcher told you." I studied my feet in the gloom. I didn't want to admit that I had been told no such thing, that I had been led to that conclusion by fear. Probably, I mumbled. It was the best that I could do, and I hated the sound of my voice at that moment. "Well," the driver growled, "I don't know rightly what that means either, but I'm not gonna stand here debating who said what while there's somebody on this train who needs a helping hand." And with that, he began to walk off down the train. I stayed rooted to the spot. The woman started to follow him. I really didn't want to go back that way, but I also didn't want to be on my own. I had seen enough scary movies to know what happened to the person who was left on their own in the dark. Muttering obscenities, I set off after them. The carriages were transformed by the darkness into one long, ominous passageway. Ahead of me, I could make out the edges of the driver's flashlight in two shadowy forms. They were moving rapidly towards where the man sat. My heart beating faster and faster, I kept pace. And there he was, the man still slumped against the seat. I could only see his legs at first. The driver was blocking my view and the woman standing off to one side. She had a hand over her mouth as if she was stifling a scream. I took another step forwards. I felt compelled to see now. I needed to know what was revealed in the beam of the flashlight. I moved in between the driver and the woman and cold fear rushed through me. The discoloration on the man's face had continued to spread. His skin, where it was exposed, was a dark layer of decaying matter. And on his face, around his eyes, his rotting flesh had collapsed inwards, exposing the pale orbs of his eyes in all their fullness. They were staring blindly into the flashlight's beam. As my mind processed this hideous sight, I noticed that there were flies crawling through the man's scalp as well. The only small mercy was that the rattling sound had ceased. His mouth hung open, but there was no breathing going on. He was dead. I swallowed down the bile which had risen into the back of my mouth and turned to the driver and said in a hoarse and shaky voice, "Satisfied now?" "I don't understand," he said. "Yeah, me neither," I told him. "Can we get out of here and leave it to the authorities?" He tore his gaze away from the decomposing corpse and lowered his flashlight, casting the dead man back into the darkness. And then he said, "You're right, we should get out of here. There's a control for the doors at the rear of the train. We can use that to get out and walk along the tracks." I told him that sounded good to me. The woman hesitated. She was still looking at the body. "We should cover him up. It's the decent thing to do." There is no decency in this place, in my opinion. There was sickness and death. "Forget it," I said, and put a hand on her elbow. Barely touching her, I just wanted her to hurry up. She did start to move. I was alongside her. The driver was in the lead, using his flashlight to show the way. But then she hesitated again. She turned to look back and her mouth opened. And this time she did scream. I span around. The driver flashed the beam towards where we had been. The corpse was no longer slumped on the seat. It was standing up. I rubbed my eyes and told myself that I was seeing things, but when I looked again, the corpse was still there. Its back was to us and it was completely still. The only movement was the small cloud of flies buzzing around its head. They must have flown off when he stood. The flies had left the building, I thought, and a hysterical laugh bubbled inside me. This was insane. the dead did not rise. Only this nightmare vision had. It had stood up and now it was turning, slowly and carefully, as it was trying to remember how to move. And now it was looking at us with its bulging bloodshot eyes. Its cracked lips were twitching and drawing back to reveal yellow teeth. Its arms were lifting and its hands reaching out towards us, seeming to grasp at the flashlight's beam. And then it began to shuffle towards us, inch by inch. "Run," I heard the driver say this, but I couldn't respond. "Now." His voice rose over the sound of my ragged breathing, but I still couldn't react. I was aware that by my side the woman was moving. I felt her hand on my cheek and she turned my head so that we were looking at each other. I was aware that tears were running down her face. "Please," she said quietly, "we have to run." I nodded and snapped out of my daze, and together the three of us stumbled away. The risen corpse followed, but its movements were so clumsy and unsure that it could not match our speed. It threw its head back and a distorted howl filled the carriage. It was thick with anger and pain and frustration. We were escaping its foul rage. The driver reached a door at the end of the final carriage, unlocked it, and disappeared inside. The light on the door lock glowed. I slammed my hand against it as the driver reappeared. The door opened and he led the way out. There was a jump down to reach the ground. After closing and locking the door using a button behind a hatch in the side of the train, the driver said, "Keep to the edge. The live track is in the center. You'll be fried if you step on it." I squeezed as close against the tunnel wall as I could get, and I hurried along until I emerged into the night air. There were stars in the sky, but there were no street lamps or buildings or vehicles in sight. "It's a long walk to the nearest platform," the driver said. "And for safety's sake, we should get off the tracks now and follow the line from alongside it." His flashlight illuminated a weed-covered verge at shoulder height that ran alongside the tracks. I scrambled up onto it first. The woman followed, but as she clambered up over the edge, she cursed. "I've dropped my phone," she said. The driver laughed. It was good to hear someone laugh, especially him. He had a deep, warm laugh. "Don't worry about it, little lady. I can see it just there. I'll get it and then join you." He took a few steps forwards, leaned over, and when he stood up straight, he had the phone in his hand. The woman gave him a thumbs up, but then she froze. There was a new sound in the air, a clattering noise. We all looked in the direction that the sound was coming from and saw the helicopter as it came into view. The driver whooped and said, "There's the cavalry." He started to walk along the edge of the tracks towards the approaching helicopter, the recovered phone in one hand, his flashlight in the other. He began to wave his arms in the air. "Down here," he yelled. From the verge, the woman and I watched. I started to get a bad feeling. Why was there a helicopter? An ambulance or a police cruiser off-roading into view would have been a welcome sight. But this dark shape, growing in the night sky, its blades turning, its engine roaring, seemed out of place. The woman must have picked up on my unease because she said, "It'll be an air ambulance. It's the quickest way to get help here." Which it would have made sense, but the helicopter was close enough now for me to see that there were no markings on it. An air ambulance would have had some kind of healthcare cross, surely. It dipped and slowed and began to hover a few dozen feet in front of the driver. He had stopped waving his arms. I think that he had realized something was wrong as well, and he was hideously right. There was the sharp crack of a weapon being fired from the helicopter. He span and fell. I waited for him to move, and I begged silently for him to move, but he just lay there. Enclosed in the darkness of the night, the woman whispered, "They murdered him." I was too shocked to say anything. It seemed hideously clear that whoever was in the helicopter had not come to help. They were agents of malevolence. Survival instincts kicking in, and I began to shuffle backwards, keeping as low as possible and making as little noise as I could. The crew of the helicopter hadn't shown any signs that they knew the woman and I were there on the verge, and we needed to keep it that way. The woman clearly got that. She rolled over onto her front and began to crawl after me. She caught up with me and tugged my sleeve, pointed at something behind me. I twisted my neck around and saw a line of trees. While the helicopter's engine continued to growl threateningly, we scrambled into the extra cover that they provided and knelt there trying to catch our breath. I didn't dare turn on the flashlight on my phone, but my eyes had begun to adjust to the darkness so that I could see tears were falling down her face. "I didn't even know the driver's name," she said. I thought how the driver had mentioned that he had grandkids, and a cold, sick feeling filled my stomach. "Me neither," I said. The woman exhaled deeply and then held out a hand. "I'm Helen, by the way." "James," I replied, and we shook hands. It was crazily formal given our situation, but somehow felt like the right thing to do. "Pleased to meet you, James. So what on earth do we do now?" I breathed out. "Honestly, I don't know. I could call 911 again, but I suspect any call from my phone will be transferred straight to whoever sent that helicopter." "You know that you sound out there, like conspiracy theory paranoid," Helen said. I shrugged. "I don't think it counts as paranoia if they're out to get you." "A fair comment. How about family friends, somebody that you can trust?" I lived alone and my social life was non-existent, and my parents had passed away. "No. How about you?" "I moved halfway across the country to begin a new life with my boyfriend, but left him last week when I found out that he was cheating on me, and Her voice began to break and she couldn't go on. I was trying to think what I could say when the sound of an explosion filled the night. We both instinctively flinched and covered our heads with our hands. After a moment, I looked up. "Are you hurt?" I asked Helen. She answered, "Shook up, but no, I think I'm fine." The explosion sounded like it came from over by the train tracks. She crept forward and peered out into the night. I shuffled alongside her and swore silently. There was smoke streaming out of the entrance to the tunnel, and the helicopter was circling high above. "I think they just fired a missile at the train," Helen whispered. "Yeah, destroying the evidence," I added in a shocked whisper of my own. As smoke continued to billow from the tunnel, the helicopter veered away. The silence that it left behind didn't last for long. In the distance, sirens began to sound. Their cries sent fresh waves of fear through me. "We need to get out of here, now." I gave her a thumbs up, and together we scrambled deeper into the woods. My mind was racing with chaotic thoughts. I had gone from being a downtrodden advertising executive to a fugitive in a day, and I had no idea where I was heading or what might be waiting for me. I glanced over at Helen. A line of red had raised on her cheek where she must have been scratched by a branch, and she had a set, determined expression on her face. Hey, at least I'm not alone, I thought, and I hurried on through the darkness as the sounds of the sirens rose and fell in the night. We stumbled on. A while later, I honestly can't say how long or how far we had gone from the tracks in the tunnel. The trees began to thin out. There was a building visible on the open ground. And I was done. I sat down heavily and gasped. "I can't take another step, I'm sorry." Helen sat on the ground beside me. She was shaking and breathing heavily. It took her a minute before she could speak. "Can you use your phone to try and find our location? It's not much, but it's a start." "Sure," I replied. I took my phone out and smiled when I saw that I had 3 bars. There was also a news alert on the screen. The headline displayed sent a chill down my spine. "Commuter train destroyed in collision with freight train." I clicked on the link and held the phone out so that Helen could read the story as well. It detailed how a passenger train had broken down in a tunnel and been struck at speed by a freight train transporting chemicals cross-country. The driver of the commuter train was confirmed as a fatality, and there was the possibility of more. Sources were quoted saying the cause that led to this tragic accident were being investigated, but it was believed a signal fault could have been to blame. I felt sickened by what I had read. It's all lies, a cover-up. Helen looked at me and said bitterly, I wonder if we'll be among the fatalities when they add to the lies later on. I hesitated. I hated myself for the thought that had just occurred to me, but I decided that I couldn't keep it to myself. Which could be a good thing, I said quietly. It would mean they think that we're still on the train when they destroyed it. It would mean that we could walk away from this. Helen looked disgusted, and honestly, I didn't blame her. I just can't walk away from this, she said. I can't forget the driver or the man who became that thing on the train. He was a human once, just like you and me. Though maybe he was better than us and he had people who cared about him. A wife, children. I don't know, but it strikes me he's a victim here as well. I couldn't even look at her. I was so ashamed. I thought desperately how to redeem myself, and inspiration struck. There should be a phone number or an email for the news desk, I told her. I can contact them and tell them the truth. I found a phone number and was about to call it when Helen put her hand on my wrist. Wait, she said. We don't actually know if they think that we're dead. They could still be looking for us. I guess, I replied hesitantly. But why should that stop me from phoning the news desk? A journalist won't give us up to the authorities, and once the story is out, then we'll be fireproof. She shook her head. It won't get that far. They have your name and number from the 911 call that you made. The minute that you make a phone call, it could set off an alert that they've set up to cover the bases. My finger hovered over the keypad, and this was a nightmare. Every action could have a negative consequence. There could be danger no matter what we did or where we went. There were shadows everywhere. I looked at my phone and said, Yeah, now that I think about it, I believe the authorities can track your location from your phone. You don't even need to be using it to make a call, it just needs to be turned on. Helen cursed, which I took to mean that she agreed with me. I didn't make the call. I turned the phone off, and for safe measure, I took out the SIM card and battery and I threw them away. And this didn't help my nerves one bit though. Neither did Helen, crawling forwards. Wait, I hissed. We can't just stay here, she whispered back. I waited for a moment, hoping hysterically that the ground would open up and swallow me and then I wouldn't have to do anything. But the ground remained hard and cold beneath my feet. So I took a deep breath and followed. Coming closer, I saw that the building was a diner. There was a single truck parked up outside, and there was a man outlined in the light from the window. He was smoking a cigarette and yawning. After taking a last drag on the cigarette, he crushed the butt underfoot and then headed for the truck. Helen was watching him, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. I was wishing that I had met her in different circumstances. Encountering a zombie, being on the run, and one wrong move away from an early grave was hardly an ideal first date in anybody's books. I realized that she was looking at me, gawping at her. I must have been an open book because she said, I'm not sure this is the time or place for getting romantic. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but then she smiled, and there was a gentle twinkle in her eyes that made me feel better. I asked, So, if this isn't the moment for a proposal, what do you think our next step should be? She answered decisively, Keep moving, keep putting distance between ourselves and the tunnel. Once we have some breathing space, then maybe we think properly of a way out of this, and I can see our ride about to depart. She got to her feet, strode right up to the trucker and asked him for a ride. And 5 minutes later, we were on the road. We passed police cars speeding down the highway, their sirens flashing, and each time I saw one, my stomach cramped up. But thankfully, they were all heading in the opposite direction. I wondered if they knew what had really happened at the tunnel and decided that they probably did not. The rank and file would be kept in the dark by the high-ranking officials pulling the strings. They knew the truth, and so did I. It was a heavy burden to carry, but even so, as the night slipped by, I found my eyelids growing heavy. The cabin was dark and hot, and I must have fallen asleep because I found myself being shaken awake by Helen. I blinked at her and rubbed my eyes. "Time to go," she said. I saw that dawn was close and that we appeared to be on the outskirts of a city. There were high-rises in the distance, and the buildings on either side of the road were 1- or 2-story structures. Many of them looked to be run down. The signs on shop fronts were faded, and there was graffiti on walls and boarded-up windows. Helen turned to the driver and said, "Could you pull up here?" The truck rattled to a halt and we clambered out. "Why did you want to get out here?" I asked. "Surely we would have been better going into the city center. It would be safer, and there are shops that don't look as if they're about to fall down, and we could have found somewhere to stay." "We already have somewhere to stay," she replied with a deadpan expression on her face. Linking her arm in mine, she led me back down the street. We passed the seediest-looking bar that I had ever seen. There were steel shutters over the windows and music, and the sound of breaking glass drifted out of the door. Further down the street, we reached a building that stood on its own in between 2 empty lots. It looked to me like it should have been knocked down as well, but the hotel stood there in all its shabby glory. There was a vacancy sign in one of the windows. "Gee, that's a pleasant surprise," I muttered. "I would have thought they would have been all booked out." Helen gave me a playful tap on the back of the head and told me that I was a wise ass. After we had checked in, paying cash to a man behind the desk, wearing a white vest and with dark hair sprouting from his shoulders, and we were in our room, Helen explained why this dive was ideal for us. "If they're laying digital traps, they could have facial tracking software set up to look out for you on CCTV cameras. The city's center will be full of them, but there will be a lot less around here, and I definitely didn't see any on the street when the truck drove down it." "But how would they know what I look like?" I asked. "Well, they know your name and phone number. It's simple enough after that to find your social media or your company's personal page online. And a snapshot of you is just the start of it. They can easily find where you bank, get the details in your account, and set up another alert which will go off if you use your card." I was sitting on the lumpy bed as she spoke and started to feel that all hope was draining away. "So I can't contact anyone. I need to stay away from cameras on the street, and I can't use my card. Well, what can I do?" I asked. She actually smiled when she answered. "They don't know who I am, so you sit pretty while I go shopping." And with that, she was gone. Left alone in the dank, grim room, I started to worry that she wouldn't come back. I mean, why would she stay? She had a credit card that she could use and could have been on a bus heading to anywhere in the country easily enough. I sat there and sweated for what felt like a very long time. When Helen returned, I was so relieved that I leapt to my feet and stood there watching wide-eyed as she put the things that she had bought on the bed. There was cola and snacks, toothbrushes and toothpaste, and a change of clothes for both of us, and a laptop computer that looked about 10 years old. "I got it from a shop that sold everything from rat poison to dumbbells to these." She said and took a USB out of her pocket. "Pay-as-you-go internet connection," she explained. "Now let's bring ourselves up to speed." We started with a news search for the incident by the tunnel. The story had spread across a lot of outlets, but there were no updates, which meant no confirmation of other casualties yet. A good thing in a way. It meant that I might be a dead man in the authorities' eyes, and all the alerts that we were worrying about were a figment of our paranoid imaginations. The next thing that we did was go on the website for the Stoller Institute. They had employed the zombie as a research associate before he had turned. A quick scan of the About Us section showed that they carried out cutting-edge work in biochemistry through contracts for high-end corporate and government clients. It was light on the details and heavy on the buzzwords. Glossy text that somebody like me could have written. And then we went to the Who We Are page and hurried past the CEO, directors, and the heads of departments until we had reached a listing for the research associates. The man who had been on the train was not listed. It's even easier to delete somebody's digital footprint than find out what they had for breakfast. Helen commented and opened a bag of potato chips. We spent the rest of the day checking for news updates, snacking and catching up on our sleep. I slept in a chair that had seen much better days. Helen crawled under the covers on the bed. She still wore the headphones around her neck and pulled them over her ears before closing her eyes. I don't think she turned them on to listen to music. It was more of a comfort thing. In the evening, she went out to get a pizza. While we were tucking in, I thought for the first time about my job. When I didn't show up that morning, did anybody worry about me? I wondered. Probably not, I soon decided. It was more likely that they already fired me and were hiring some other poor slob to treat like dirt. Good luck to them, I thought, and bit into another slice of pizza. Our days and nights settled into a strange rhythm after this. Helen added old-school paper copies of local and national newspapers to the shopping list, which we devoured along with online outlets for any updates on the tunnel incident. There were no details, though, and the story lost traction as time wore on. It appeared the authorities' lies were sinking out of sight. But we did find other stories. The CEO of the Stoller Institute was struck by a car and killed while out jogging. The driver hadn't stopped and the police had no leads. A warehouse in the same district as the Stoller Institute headquarters was gutted by a fire. With a little digital detective work, we found out that it was owned by a subsidiary of the institute, and a military helicopter crashed in what was described as a tragic training accident. There were no survivors among the crew. Anyone else who might have come across these stories would most likely have thought that they were unconnected happenings in the daily news cycle. But we saw the connection. We knew that the cover-up was ongoing. After a week, though, the original stories about the so-called collision at the tunnel had still not been updated, and were being relegated to the archives section of the news sites. And there were no new articles which we could link to the cover-up. The pressure felt as if it was lifting, and I started to feel safer. One morning while Helen was out on her daily shop, I sat on the bed staring at the same four walls. The room was disgusting and cramped, and I had a sudden desperate urge to get out of there. Just to stretch my legs for 10 minutes, I thought. Surely it couldn't do any harm, and Helen would not even have to know that I had left the hotel. With my mind made up, I went out for the first time since we had checked in, and boy did it feel good. Even though the neighborhood was run down, being out in the fresh air and able to just walk wherever I wanted was such a relief. I crossed one of the empty lots, stepping around to broken bricks, and walked along a street, and I was surprised to find that I was at the entrance to a small park. It was overgrown and there was broken glass and cigarette butts scattered around, but when I sat on one of the wooden benches at its edge, I could have been in a carefully tended grand city park from the smile on my face. I knew that Helen would be back soon enough, so I had to drag myself away before I would have liked. I was in a bit of a daze as I headed back to the hotel, so much so that I took a wrong turn and found myself on the wrong street. I figured that it ran parallel to where I wanted to be, so no big deal, and I continued to the end of the street so that I could hang a right. There was a drugstore on the corner, and fixed to the wall across from it was a CCTV camera. The happiness that I had been feeling drained away. Not only was I in line with the camera's lens, but I was staring right at it. I panicked and began to walk away. It was less than a minute before I was back at the hotel, and then I was running to the room, unlocking the door with shaking hands and hurrying inside. I sat on the floor in a corner with my knees hugged against my chest, and I felt my heart beating as if it was fit to burst. When Helen got back 30 minutes later, there was no point in me even pretending that everything was all right. I told her what had happened. She heard me out and then started to pace around the room swearing. It might be okay, I tried. Her pacing had brought her to the window. She turned and looked out into the street. It is not. They're here. I jumped to my feet and went over to the window. There was a dark van parked in the corner just down from the drugstore, and another one parking up close to the bar. Men and women with short military-style haircuts and wearing plain business suits were getting out and hammering on doors, showing IDs, and when the doors were opened, then pushing their way inside. My face had been tagged by a program somewhere and an alert had been sent out. Teams were dispatched and now it was only a matter of time before they made it to the hotel and knocked on our door. They knew that I was alive and the cover-up was back on. "We have to go now," Helen said and sprinted for the door. I stayed where I was at. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Leave me here," I said. "They still don't even know who you are. You should get away while you can." She replied without missing a beat. "No way, we're in this together. We can back up each other's stories when we do go public, and besides..." She did hesitate now and glanced away for a second before going on. "Besides, I've grown kind of fond of you. It's still a lousy moment to propose, but you never know. One day." It was a crazy time for her to be saying this. Crazier than when we had introduced ourselves with a formal handshake. But it worked for me. I hurried over to her side and we ran for the exit. But we were too late. One of the suited, stern-faced women was showing her ID to the receptionist. He looked worried and then his eyes lit up as he spotted us. "That's the man you're looking for," he yelled, "with his girlfriend." The woman span around and a smile of triumph flickered on her face. She reached for the holster at her waist, but she did not make it. Helen threw herself forward and knocked the other woman off her feet. And then Helen was jumping over the prone woman and screaming at me to move it. I did not need to hear it twice. I vaulted the woman, narrowly avoiding a flailing shoe as she tried to kick my ankles. She had the sidearm in her hand now as well, and was aiming. I hurtled out onto the street. There were more suited figures across the road, and they were turning to look at us. And then the sound of a gun being fired rang out. The woman had taken a shot. Her colleagues reacted instinctively by crouching, and that gave us a second. We sprinted down the street. We didn't look back as more shots rang out and voices yelled at us to stop. We weaved chaotically through narrow lanes and scrambled over broken walls until Helen shouted, "In here!" and she grabbed me by the arm and led us into a derelict building. I sank to my knees. Helen sat heavily against a wall and placed a hand on her stomach, where blood had spread through the fabric of her t-shirt. She lifted the bottom of the shirt and looked at the wound. "Never been shot before," she said and laughed bitterly. She had started to shake and was breathing rapidly. I moved closer and I took her hand in mine. "Hey, you're gonna be fine," I said. "We'll get you to the ER, and while they're fixing you up, I'm gonna tell the world about these stone-cold killers." Another harsh laugh rippled through her. It clearly hurt. She put a hand on my cheek and somehow smiled. "That's not gonna happen," she said, her voice reduced to a whisper, and each word causing her a fresh wave of pain. "You need to go. You can't use either of our cards now. You need cash. Take these." She took her headphones off and pushed them against my chest. The headphones that had been the first thing that I had noticed about her in what felt like a lifetime ago. "No, I can't," I said and gently pushed the headphones back towards her. A new, crooked smile appeared on her face. "Don't be an idiot. Take them, sell them, and keep going until you're safe. And one word of advice, you sweet, lovely man. Don't use the train." She was the most amazing person that I had ever met, the most beautiful woman. I kissed her on the forehead and said to her for the first time, "I love you." But I was too late. She was gone. I did as she told me, and despite the odds stacked against me, I made it. I'm south of the border now, living off-grid. The pain that I feel from losing Helen burns in me every moment of every day, and it drives me on. They tried to silence me and they failed. I know about the zombie virus, and one day soon the truth will prevail. Today's episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. Can you name every single subscription that you have? I know that I can't name all of mine. And I'm not alone. I just learned that over 74% of people have subscriptions that they've forgotten about. With Rocket Money, I don't have to remember every subscription or worry about forgetting any, because I can see them all laid out right in front of me. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's features. Stop wasting money on things that you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. That's rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. It was a sleepy summer's day in my hometown when Frank Wallace opened his front door and stepped out onto the street. I was sitting on my porch opposite, holding a cold bottle of beer against my cheek. It was too hot to do anything else in my humble opinion. Frank was in his 60s and had owned the bar on Main Street until he sold it last fall. He lived on his own, and life as a single retired gentleman seemed to be suiting him just fine. I'd see him strolling in town with a lady on his arm, or sitting in the park reading a book with a contented smile on his face. Frank was usually smartly turned out as well, favoring pressed shirts, bow ties, and waistcoats, but he was wearing a creased, collarless shirt with braces. One of the braces was unbuckled and hung loose. I thought how it wasn't like Frank to be so scruffy, but it was too hot to dwell on this, so I forgot about it and raised an arm to say hello. Frank did not acknowledge my wave. He was just standing there looking lost. This was not so easy to brush off. I was concerned. I wondered if Frank's AC was not working, if the heat was making him feel ill and he had come outside to try and find some relief. There was none to be found out on the street though. I got to my feet and called out, "Hey Frank, you okay? You want to come over for a cold one in the shade?" Frank's gaze drifted towards me. His mouth opened slightly as if he was about to say something, and then he fell to his knees. It all happened so quick. I froze for a moment in shock and then dropped my beer and started to run towards him to help. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another one of my neighbors hurrying forwards as well. Lorna Johnson had been a nurse at a city center ER before moving to the town, and after seeing her I thought, whatever is wrong, it's going to be okay. And then Frank began to scream. It was hideous, sounding more like a wild animal crying out in fear and pain than a man. Lorna had reached Frank's side, but I could see that she was hesitating. Even with her experience as a nurse, she was clearly shocked by the way that he was screaming. But she set her face in a determined expression, put a hand on his shoulder, and began to speak to him. Frank didn't seem to know that she was there. He reached up and touched his face, and then he began to rake his fingernails down his skin, leaving vivid red lines in their wake. He raked his fingernails down again and again, and I could see blood flowing now where he was cutting open his own skin. Lorna was trying to stop him by grabbing his wrist, but he was far too strong for her. "Help me," she said. A crowd had gathered now, drawn out of their houses by Frank's hideous screams, but I realized she was speaking to me because I was the closest. I stumbled up to Frank and took a hold of one of his arms. I could see the blood and skin under his fingernails and the ragged lines of raw flesh that had been exposed in his face. A wave of nausea rushed through me, and I was fighting not to puke as I tried to help restrain Frank. We couldn't stop him though. He was frantic and kept scratching at himself viciously. It was like he was trying to claw his own skin off. "Frank, stop it," I pleaded, but he remained oblivious. His eyes were glazed over and froth was appearing at the corners of his mouth as he continued to scream and claw. Mercifully, more people were stepping up to try and help. I glanced to my side to see Bill Monroe, the deputy. He was trying to handcuff Frank and had one cuff around Frank's wrist. I put all my strength into trying to keep Frank's free arm still enough for Bill to get the other restraint on. He did, and he locked them. I breathed a momentary sigh of relief. At least Frank could not hurt himself anymore. And no matter how much he thrashed around now, the sheer weight of people holding him down was keeping him pinned to the ground. Bill said, "I'll call an ambulance, but until that gets here, I want Frank off the street, and a holding cell is the best place that I can think to put him in just now." Sweat dripped from his face as he spoke, and I could hear the tension in his voice. The worst that he usually had to deal with was traffic violations and folk who had too much to drink on a Friday night. He was out of his depth here, but he was right about the cell as far as I could see. After Doc Wilson had lost his medical license last year due to his need to keep topped up with bourbon to hold the shakes at bay, there wasn't a doctor in the town with premises that we could take Frank to. The only other alternatives left were the bar that he used to own, the store, the chapel, or one of our houses, and none of them seemed right. So, supervised by Lorna and Bill, a group of us lifted Frank and carried him the short distance to the jailhouse. He struggled less and less as we manhandled him along the street, and by the time that we arrived and put him down on a wooden bench in one of the two cells, all the fight seemed to have gone out of him. He just lay there breathing heavily while the makeshift party of concerned townsfolk dispersed. Lorna insisted on staying with Frank in the unlocked cell. I trailed after Bill to his office. I had no reason to be there apart from being badly shook up and wanting company, and Bill Monroe would have to do. He was mopping up some of the sweat from his face with a handkerchief that was already soaked wet through and making a phone call. I listened as he explained who he was and what had happened, and nodded in response to the person on the other end of the line. He had just finished the call when Lorna walked into the office. He told her, "The dispatcher said it'll be at least 2 hours before an ambulance can get here." Bill looked as if he was about to say more, but he ground to a halt. He had noticed the sadness on Lorna's face. She exhaled and said, "Frank has passed." Bill's shoulders slumped and I sat down heavily in a chair in the corner of his office. I think we both felt equally lost. Our neighbor who had been so full of life had been taken from us in such a sudden and shocking way. Lorna was clearly still thinking straight. She looked at Bill and said, "The paramedics will look after Frank's body when they arrive, but before they get here, we should take the handcuffs off. It's only right." Bill stared back at her blankly and showed no signs of moving. I guess he was so rattled he couldn't face going through to the cell and removing the handcuffs from Frank's body. Lorna held out her hand and said to him in a gentle voice, "It's okay, I'll do it." Bill gave her the keys and then sat with his head bowed until she returned. She put the handcuffs and key on the desk next to Bill and then said, "We might as well be comfortable while we're waiting for the paramedics. Would you two like to come back to my house for some iced tea?" My clothes were stuck to my skin with sweat and my mouth was parched. The idea of iced tea at Lorna's place was irresistible. I told her this, and Bill gave her a thumbs up and the three of us set off. The heat shimmered in the street and the skin on the back of my neck felt like it was burning. Thankfully, Lorna's place was already in sight. As we passed my house on the way, I noticed the bottle of beer that I had dropped lying on the ground and decided that I didn't have the strength to pick it up just then. I saw as well that Frank's front door was still open, and a fresh wave of sadness enveloped me as I wondered who would sort out the things that Frank had left behind. Frank had no family living in the town, but beyond that, I had no idea. I turned to Bill to ask him about Frank's next of kin, but Bill was staring back down the street at a figure walking slowly towards us. I saw who it was, and the heat of day fell away. Frank was shuffling unsteadily along. The dry blood of his self-inflicted wounds glistened darkly in the sunlight. His eyes were darker still. The sweat coating my skin felt like it had turned to ice, and I was starting to shiver violently as I said to Lorna, You made a mistake." Keeping her eyes fixed on Frank, she shook her head and replied, "The man that I left in the cell was dead. I swear on all my 30 years as a nurse that was the case. I do not know what's happening here, but it's wrong. It's against nature." I hugged myself as her words sunk in. I swallowed, desperately trying to get some moisture into my throat. I looked at Frank, at the thing that should not have been, and panic gripped me. He was coming closer. It was coming closer. And I could not move. I could not breathe. It was hot as hell in my hometown, and I was in a waking nightmare. The monster in my twisted reality opened its mouth, and a guttural groan escaped its lips. It shuffled closer, raised its arms, reaching out to me, and then its maw opened wide. Drool hung from its teeth. It was as if the rest of the world had drifted away from me and everything had focused in on the aberration that was bearing down on me. And then I heard a voice saying, "I need you to back off." I blinked, coming out of my daze, and turned and saw that Bill had his sidearm raised and aimed at the thing that Frank had become. "Please," Bill shouted. "I don't want to do this, but I will. I can't let you hurt anyone." The monster gazed at Bill. There was no humanity in its eyes. There was only rage as it threw itself at the deputy. A sharp sound made me flinch, and the monster's head was slammed backwards as a bullet struck. It fell to the ground. There was a sickening wound in the center of its forehead. Despite this, it was still twitching and clawing at the air and trying to bite even though there was nothing in reach of its teeth. And then it grew still, and all the fire went out of its hideous gaze. Bill, Lorna, and I just looked at each other for a moment. I saw the shock that I was feeling reflected in their eyes. And then Bill began to shake his head. "Oh man," he said. "Oh man, I need to call this in." He holstered his sidearm, took out his phone. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him 3 goes to get the passcode right. And then he turned his back on us and walked away. I couldn't hear what was said after this, but it was an animated conversation on Bill's side. He was pointing and waving his free hand and pacing around. While he was lost in his phone call, people started to emerge cautiously from their houses. The sound of a weapon being discharged was not something that you rushed towards. I saw Mrs. Krinsky, who worked at the store, hovering by her husband's side with her hand over her mouth. Mr. Krinsky had been in the armed forces until shrapnel from an IED had shattered his kneecap, and he leaned heavily on his stick, frowning. Down the street, Jim Turner was standing framed in his doorway, blinking in the too bright light. Jim used to run an auto repair shop in town, but it had gone out of business, and now he was struggling to get by selling scrap metal and doing odd jobs where he could. Doc Wilson was out as well. He was on his porch, cradling a glass of amber liquid to his chest. There were plenty more folk joining them by now. A few had strayed as far as the street, and everybody was gawping at the figure lying on the ground. The fresh damage to its face was so bad that I wasn't sure if people would recognize that it was Frank's corpse. And if they did, I wondered if they would believe their own eyes. After all, wasn't Frank meant to be in the cell being taken care of by Lorna and the deputy? I looked back over at Bill, wishing that he would hurry up and finish his call. There would be a whole bunch of questions coming soon, and I had no answers. Finally, Bill lowered his phone and headed back. He looked around at the townsfolk and scowled. "You all need to get back inside," he said in a raised voice. "There is no danger to your health or your property, and this is a matter for the law to deal with." No one looked convinced, and Mr. Krinsky called back. "Look, Bill, none of us want to cause trouble, but there's something mighty wrong going on here." Bill glared at him, and I could see that he was fighting to keep his temper in check. He took a deep breath before replying. "I would have thought you, of all people, would respect the badge I'm wearing and do as you were being asked. So please." Bill left the request for Mr. Krinsky to shut up and go away hanging in the air. The veteran looked like he was going to stand his ground, though, until his wife gently elbowed him in the ribs and began to lead him back inside. Bill glowered at him until he was gone, and then turned his gaze to the rest of the townsfolk who were still outside. There was plenty of muttering, but no more challenges to Bill's authority. As doors were pulled closed, Bill pinched the brow of his nose and sighed. He looked exhausted. Lorna put her hand on his arm and said, "You're doing just fine, Bill. What did the sheriff say? Are they sending help?" He nodded. "Yes, though I'm not sure they believed me when I told them what had happened. I reckon they think the heat has got to me." Lorna smiled sympathetically and then threw a look my way as she said, "We both saw the same thing, and we'll tell the sheriff you saved a life here today. Now let's get this body covered up for decency's sake and go and have that drink. If you don't get some liquid inside you, Bill Monroe, seeing things will be the least of your problems." Bill managed a small smile himself at this and trudged after her into her house. I followed, not wanting to be left alone with the corpse. Soon after, all I could think about was the glass of iced tea that Lorna gave me. The three of us were in her orderly kitchen, and the drink was the most wonderful, refreshing thing that had ever existed in my humble opinion. Bill looked a lot better once he had a drink as well, and he sounded calmer when he said, "Yeah, once the backup and the ambulance arrive, we can start to get things back to normal." "I'll drink to that," I said and raised my glass. Before it reached my lips, Lorna's door flew open and Mrs. Krinsky ran inside. "My husband, there's something wrong with him." Lorna reacted first. She took Mrs. Krinsky's hands in hers and said, "Tell us what happened." "He was very quiet when we got inside. I thought he was angry with me for intervening and telling him to stop being so dang cranky. But he just stood there staring into space. It was like I wasn't there, and then he collapsed." She began to sob as she went on. "I thought that I had lost him out there in the desert. When he came home, he promised me that we would grow old together. Please, you have to help." "We will," Lorna said with remarkable calmness. I was aware of the hum of her AC, of the clock on our kitchen wall ticking quietly, of my heart beating. It was too loud, too quick. I put my hand on my chest, and then I heard the scream. We all did. And I think we all knew that it was coming from the Krinsky's house. Knew that it was Mr. Krinsky who was howling in primal fear and pain, not an animal. Lorna looked at me and Bill and said, "I'll stay with her, you two go." Reluctantly, I followed Bill, who was already hurrying out of the kitchen. I kept behind him as he ran towards the Krinsky's place. I wasn't a deputy, and there was no way that I was going to be the first one through that door. I could see Bill standing in the kitchen as I crossed the threshold. Mr. Krinsky was on the floor close by, screaming and clawing at his skin. Bill reached for his belt where he kept his handcuffs and then cursed. He had left them back at the jailhouse. And so he grabbed Krinsky's wrists and struggled to pin them to the ground. "Help me," he yelled. I moved around them both and pressed down on Krinsky's shoulders. Blood running from the wounds that Krinsky had gouged into his face, mingled with foam bubbling from his mouth. I was worried that he would choke, worried that we wouldn't be able to hold him. But we did manage to keep him from hurting himself anymore, and slowly he seemed to calm down. Eventually, he stopped struggling altogether. "It's gonna be okay, there's help on the way," Bill said, trying to reassure him. Krinsky stared up. His eyes were wide with terror as he whispered in a hoarse voice, "It's inside me. I have to get it out." "What's inside you?" Bill asked. Krinsky replied with a single word, "Evil." And then he died. Bill let go of him and moved away, and I did the same. I needed to get out of there, and I started towards the door. But Bill held up a hand. "Wait, we need to make sure Krinsky is not going to attack anyone if he comes back like Frank did." It should have been a crazy thought, not something that rational people believed, but I did not challenge Bill. "You're going to use your sidearm," I began, thinking this was what he had meant, but he shook his head. "I can't desecrate a dead body no matter what. No, we'll tie him up good and proper, make sure if something does stir, it can't go anywhere." And then he pulled over a kitchen chair and asked me to get Krinsky's body into it. The idea of touching it repulsed me, but once again, I had to do the right thing. The body was still warm and slick with sweat as we wrapped our arms around it and lifted it onto the chair. Between us, we found belts and rope and tore up blankets and fixed them around the corpse. A disgusting job, but it was done, and finally we could get out of there. There was a key inside the door, and Bill took it and locked up on the way out. As we headed back to Lorna's house, I had to force myself not to look back over my shoulder. Despite everything that we had done, I could not escape the feeling that if I did look around, I would see Mr. Krinsky shuffling unsteadily along the street. Alongside me, Bill was on his phone making a call. Well, trying to anyway. He cursed and then said, "I need to update the sheriff, but I can't get through. I've got no signal on my phone." I checked mine and it was the same, and I had no idea why. We were arriving back at Lorna's house by now. When we walked through the open door, Mrs. Krinsky was sitting at the kitchen table. She shot to her feet and asked, "Where's my husband?" Bill said in a quiet voice, "I'm sorry." Lorna sat next to Mrs. Krinsky and began to speak to her quietly, trying to console her. Bill was trying his phone again without success from the look on his face. I hugged myself. I couldn't cope with this. I wanted to crawl into a darkened room and curl up in a corner and sleep for a long time. But there was to be no hiding place, no escape. There was a scream from somewhere in the distance, a scream born of terror and hurt. And there was someone outside Lorna's kitchen window as well. It was Jim Turner. He was looking through the window at us. He looked puzzled though, as if what he was seeing made no sense to him. He put the open palm of his hand against the glass. Trying to keep himself from falling, I realized, as Jim slumped forward against the window. He was still for a few seconds and then he began to scream. His spittle struck the glass as he screamed, and I felt sick knowing that, in the seconds that followed, he would start trying to pull his own skin off in a crazed attempt to get rid of the evil within him. But Jim did not dig his fingernails into his flesh. He started to smash his hands against the kitchen window again and again. Cracks appeared, and still he hammered at it, and the cracks widened. A shard of glass came free. Jim grabbed it and placed a viciously sharp edge against the skin on his face, and he began to cut. I turned away. I couldn't watch. I put my hands on my ears, desperately trying to block out the sound of his screams. I couldn't though, they were too loud. I began to sob and say to myself, "Oh, please stop, please." And Jim's screams did end. I lifted my hands free of my ears and listened for the distant scream that had preceded Jim's, but I couldn't hear anything. Whoever that had been had stopped as well. It was silence once more. I looked around the room. The broken glass that remained in the window was smeared with blood. Lorna and Mrs. Krinsky were huddled in a corner hugging each other in a protective embrace. Bill was staring wide-eyed with fear at the door. And the thing that had been Jim Turner was dragging itself into the kitchen on its hands and knees. It looked to have sliced the skin off its own face and then cut deeper still. I could see bone in its grotesque visage. One eye was gone and gouged out, and the socket shone with blood. The other eye remained. It was darker than any night. Bill aimed his sidearm at the monster. His hand was shaking and I thought, he's going to miss. But his aim was true. The monster slumped to the ground, its fingers reached out, and a low groan drifted from its lips, and then it was done. Bill wiped his hand across his forehead and said, "Lorna, where's your landline? I'm going to call 911. "Through in the front room," she replied, and took Bill through to show him. They returned a minute later. "Now the landline's down as well," Bill said. "I'm going to the jailhouse to use the radio. We are seriously in need of the cavalry." He headed for the door and Lorna and Mrs. Krinsky started to follow him. "No way," I thought. "We need to stay together and wait here," I protested. "Krinsky's still out there and he will have to become one of those things." His wife looked at me and I could see the raw pain in her eyes at my words. And then she turned away from me and caught up with the others as they walked away, leaving me alone and feeling like dirt. I still wanted to stay put, but I couldn't face being on my own. I did not have any pride left to swallow at this point, and so I hurried out of the door, to find that they had halted in the street. I could see why straight away. Through the heat haze, I could make out a figure shuffling uncertainly down the street. I thought that it was Krinsky at first, and that he had freed himself from his bonds as I had feared. But it was not Krinsky. Mitch Groves had bought the bar from Frank, and he had moved from the East Coast to realize his dream of running a bar in a small town. He was going to serve homemade food and there would be a warm welcome for everyone. His dream had descended into this. He had become a monster consumed by rage, shuffling along a dusty street on a brutal summer's day. We stood and watched it. The sight of its mutilated face and dark eyes made my skin crawl. Lorna and Mrs. Krinsky moved closer to each other. Bill drew his sidearm and he fired. It fell as the others had done. It reached out one last time, and then the street was still, silent, until a new scream made me flinch. A second followed in its wake, and moments later a third and then a fourth. I could not see who was screaming or tell exactly where they were coming from. None of us could. And the screams continued to multiply until they seemed to be coming from everywhere. We were transfixed by this hideous chorus until Bill shouted, "Run! We have to get to the jailhouse before they turn." I did not need telling twice. I started to run and Bill and Lorna did the same. But Mrs. Krinsky was rooted to the spot. She was captivated by the sight of the figure stumbling out of her house. It had been her husband once. Now it was a creature that had escaped from the grip of death. If the Reaper could not hold it, why did Bill and I think belts and rags could? I thought with a bitter sigh. The monster shuffled uncertainly forwards across the porch and down onto the street. It was repulsive, but Mrs. Krinsky seemed blind to this. On this strangest of all days, I think she was seeing the man that she loved. Bill yelled at her, "We need to go." But Mrs. Krinsky ignored him, and she was crying tears of joy. Bill swore and ran towards her, and he had his sidearm, but he could not use it because of the risk of hurting her. Mrs. Krinsky held her arms out to embrace her husband. A smile spread across the monster's face. Its mouth opened and drool dripped from its teeth. And Mrs. Krinsky paused. I think the mask of her delusions must have been ripped away because she cried out in fear. It was too late though. The monster was on her and it was sinking its teeth into the flesh of her shoulder and biting deep. Bill reached them and he grabbed the monster by its scalp and neck and tried to pull it away. "Help me," he yelled. Lorna and I sprinted forwards. The monster still had its teeth buried in Mrs. Krinsky's flesh and was shaking her body like she was a rag doll. There was blood everywhere and it was spraying from the edges of the wound. Lorna began to strike the monster on the side of its head with her fist to try to make it let go. I took a hold of one of its arms and tried to pull it away, but only the monster was too strong for us. We could not stop it biting, could not stop it tearing a lump of flesh free and beginning to devour it. As it ate, it lashed out with its arms at us. It swatted us away like we were flies and the three of us ended up on the ground. Mrs. Krinsky, released from its jaws, sunk to her knees and then toppled over. She lay sprawled on her side. Blood no longer spurted from the gaping wound in her shoulder. I had seen enough crime shows on TV to know what that meant. She was dead. Lorna linked her hand in mine and said, "We need to save ourselves now." Bill was pushing himself painfully to his feet. The monster was too busy gorging itself to notice the barrel being pointed at it. "Eat lead," Bill muttered and pulled the trigger. And then he turned and muttered in obscenity. I looked down the street and I echoed his curse. The screaming had stopped and the monsters had emerged. There were scores of them. They shuffled uncertainly along the sidewalks and down the road. They came out of buildings and groaned in the glare of the ceaseless sunlight. When they were alive, I could have put a name to every single one of them. But now I saw a disfigured horde of the dead that blocked the way. "We're not going to make it to the jailhouse," I said. Bill snapped back. "Oh, tell me something I don't know, genius." I looked around, desperately trying to find a way clear where we could try and escape. But the dead were everywhere that I could see. This was their town now, their domain. Thomas Allen had been a volunteer at the chapel. He swept the floor and brought flowers from his garden to place in vases for the services. His reanimated corpse was at the front of the horde. It was a dozen feet from us. I waited for Bill to aim and fire and to take it out, but Bill's arms were by his side. He was shaking his head. "It's over," he said. "There are too many of them." We all have our limits and it looked like Bill had reached his. He was a broken man with seconds left to live. The monster was reaching out to Bill, opening its mouth. Bill's shoulders started to shake as he began to sob, and the sound of a shot filled the air. The thing that had been Thomas Allen spiraled backwards. The top of its skull was lost in a cloud of crimson. The monster just behind it suffered the same fate moments later. I span around. Doc Wilson was sitting on a rocking chair on his porch with a bottle of bourbon in one hand and a long-barreled weapon in the other. "I'm gonna take myself a drink before I reload, so if you folks want to head this way and join me, now would be a good time." Bill snapped out of his daze and the three of us sprinted for Doc Wilson's place. The monsters had paused for a moment to peer at the remains of their grotesque kin, but now they were on the move again. A sickening moan was escaping their curled back lips. As we reached his porch, Doc Wilson grinned and said, "I think I made him angry." And then his eyes narrowed and he growled, "Good." He slugged a bourbon from the bottle, loosed another couple of barrels, dispatched 2 more of the things and then said, "Follow me." We followed him inside and he slammed and bolted his door. Without being asked, Bill started to drag a table over to block the door. "We need to board the windows up as well," Lorna said. Doc Wilson shook his head. "No time, the safest place is my cellar." And then he looked over at Bill, who was by the window picking up a chair for the barricade that he seemed intent on making. Doc Wilson yelled at him, "Get away from there." I don't know if Bill ever heard. The windows smashed and the dead reached through. Bill flinched and tried to get away, but the monsters had him in their grip. He cried out as they pulled him through the shattered glass, and then they fell on him in a frenzy. Bill was lost to sight, but I could see the monsters struggling over each other to reach their feast. "The cellar now," Doc Wilson yelled. "We can't help the deputy." I turned and followed him towards the cellar door. Lorna hesitated for a moment. Her face was streaked with tears. "Goodbye, my friend," she said quietly and then hurried after us. Doc Wilson ushered me through the cellar door first with Lorna on my heels. I heard the door being slammed behind me and it became too dark for me to see the stairs. I stumbled on, expecting to trip and go tumbling down at any moment, but I made it to level ground. It was darker than ever down there. To one side of me I heard Doc Wilson cussing and then saying, "Oh, there you are." A couple of seconds later, a glow appeared. It grew until I could see Doc Wilson's face. He was smiling and holding a large flashlight. "It is clockwork," he said. "Ideal when the authorities have left you high and dry." "What do you mean?" I asked. "There's no phone signal," he answered. "My landline's dead, the internet is down, and the electricity has been cut off. We've been isolated by the powers that be, so nobody can find out what's happening in this town." I had seen him drinking, and now we were in the claustrophobic cellar that I could smell the booze on his breath. And even if I hadn't, everybody knew that Doc Wilson was a hopeless drunk. The man was talking nonsense, and I needed him to see sense. "Look, Doc," I said, "Deputy Monroe called for help, and I'm sure they will be here soon. We just need to sit tight and wait for the authorities to come rescue us." He snorted with derision. "Listen to me, you fool. It's the authorities who are responsible. They tax us, they steal our personal information from our computers and phones. They put chemicals in our water, release viruses into the air, sneak subliminal messages into the information overload that surrounds us every day. We're lab rats to them, and what is happening out there is an experiment gone wrong. Now the authorities are locking this town down, and they're going to cover up this incident like they've covered up so many times before." I counted to 10 before replying in the firmest voice that I could. "That is conspiracy theory nonsense spread by people who spend too long online." Lit by the glow of his clockwork flashlight, a sad smile spread across Doc Wilson's booze-ravaged features. "If it is nonsense, why are we hiding in my cellar from crazed zombies that used to be our neighbors?" I opened my mouth to answer, but I had no answer. I had only fear as the sound of hammering on the cellar door reached me. I could hear footsteps overhead as well. The monsters who were not trying to break down the door must have been pacing up and down the floor above us, I figured. We were not safe in the cellar, we were trapped, besieged. And surely it was only a matter of time before the cellar door gave and the monsters poured down the stairs, and fresh slaughter was unleashed, or before they found a broken floorboard and pried it free. They must have known there was living flesh close by, warm flesh running with blood that they could almost taste. Directly above my head I heard wood crack, and the hammering on the cellar door intensified. Dang critters sure are keen," Doc Wilson muttered. He was over by the shelves that lined one wall of his cellar from floor to ceiling. I saw that they were loaded with canned food and bottle after bottle of booze. He noticed me staring at him. "My personal stockpile for the end times," he said. "And though the rest of the country's probably going about its business as usual and wishing it was time to leave work or watching the afternoon soaps, in our small corner of the USA, it's time to open a fresh bottle of 40% proof." Lorna had been listening quietly, but now she spoke out. "We can all have a drink later, but let's find a way out of here first." He looked at the bottle's side and said, "There's a metal grill over there at the top of that wall. Hasn't been opened in years and will be a mighty tight squeeze, but you're welcome to try, if you think there's still the chance of getting away from those things." Lorna's determined expression was the only answer required. Doc Wilson found a rusty screwdriver and hammering trailing spiderwebs from its handle on another shelf. He and Lorna got to work trying to force the grill. From the top of the stairs, the sound of wood splintering as the assault on the door continued was cascading down. And directly above me I could hear fingers scrabbling at the ceiling and feet stamping in a frantic beat. We were almost out of time. "Hurry up," I yelled, and then I heard a crack close by and the scraping of metal against metal. They had opened the grill. Lorna whooped in triumph and then said, "All I can see through the gap is overgrown grass, but that might give us some cover." She did not wait for a reply from either of us and pulled herself up and out. The soles of her shoes were the last thing I saw as she slipped from sight. Doc Wilson waved me forwards and I breathed my gut in, struggled through and found myself in the backyard. Lorna was crouched down and was almost hidden by these sprawling weeds. There was an ancient car tire there as well. Guess the doc was too busy preparing for the end of the world to spend time tidying up his backyard, I said with a crooked smile on my face as I untangled my limbs into a sitting position. Lorna ignored my attempted humor and shouted into the open grill, "What are you waiting for, Doc?" I couldn't see him, but I could hear Doc Wilson clearly enough as he said, "I haven't helped anyone since my medical license was revoked, and it feels good to have helped you too. I'm going to keep on doing that by making a stand. Hopefully that will buy you a little time, and hopefully you will think better of me. I was a good man once." Lorna looked like she was going to try and reason with Doc Wilson, but through the open grill, I could suddenly hear the rumble of the monsters' voices. They must have broken through the cellar door and were crowding into the cellar. 2 shots broke through the guttural groans. 2 only. In my mind's eye, I saw the monsters enveloping Doc Wilson and fighting with each other to bite and feed while their hideous faces became soaked with his blood. Lorna was on her feet. "He's gone. Let's go." She kept hunched over as she scurried forwards, trying to use the cover of the overgrown backyard, I figured. I pushed myself to my feet and stood a little straighter so that I could scan the horizon. I couldn't see any monsters between the doc's backyard and the open patch of land that led into the woods that bordered the town here. I didn't believe all the changed townsfolk had pursued us into the cellar, though. There must be more out there, I thought. They are close, about to attack. "Get down," Lorna implored, breaking the runaway train of my thoughts. I flinched, crouched, and stumbled after her until I was alongside her, but she was still looking back in the direction of Doc Wilson's house. At the open grill where the first of the monsters was crawling out after us, fresh blood stained its mouth and chin. "They are never going to give up," Lorna muttered grimly and turned away. Half a dozen clumsy steps later, and we were leaving Frank's backyard and breaking cover into open ground. I looked back over my shoulder. Monsters were streaming out of the cellar and shuffling our way. I glanced to my left. The other monsters had appeared from in between the houses, and it was the same to my right. They were converging in on us, a tidal wave of ravenous, murderous freaks. Eyes once more straight ahead, I ran as fast as I could for the woods. Lorna was 3 paces ahead of me. The trees were coming closer. We were almost there. Not that we would be out of danger when we made it to the woods, but we would no longer be so exposed. And about a mile away there was a road that cut through the woods that was busy with haulage trucks. We could flag down help. We would be saved. What was a mile, I figured? It was nothing. Even though my lungs were burning and the stitch in my chest was agonizing, I was going to make it. We were going to make it. Lorna was within touching distance of the trees and I was right behind. And then suddenly I was falling and my foot was twisting under me. Fresh pain flared in my leg. I tumbled to the ground, rolled, and grabbed my ankle and cried out. Lorna appeared at my side, grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. The weight of my injured ankle made me yell in pain. "Oh, deal with it," Lorna told me. And she was right. Gritting my teeth, I ran on into the forest. Lorna kept by my side. There were rustling sounds behind us and sharp cracks as fallen branches were stepped on. The monsters were in the woods and on our trail. We ran on through the half-light of the woods, weaving through the trees. Clouds of bugs and the humid undergrowth swarmed around us and birds shrieked overhead. Low-lying branches scratched my face and hands as I sprinted faster and faster. My ankle was numb by now and I had given up spitting out the bugs that were ending up in my mouth. The world was a blur around me. Apart from Lorna, who was saying, "We're almost there," over and over. I believed in her. She had shown so much strength since this madness had begun. Even so, when we emerged from the trees and found ourselves in the open standing on the tarmac, I was shocked. The cacophony of the woods was gone. The sunlight was blinding. I shielded my eyes and gazed down the road. It stretched out ahead of us. I waited for a truck to roar into view so that we could flag them down and be saved. But the road in front of us was deserted and there were no sounds of any engines in the distance. I turned. The emptiness, the silence continued. And in a matter of minutes, the monsters would catch up. They would come crashing out of the woods. "We can't stay here," I said. "We're meat for the dead." "No, wait, I can see something." I followed her gaze and I could see it as well. There was a vehicle coming over the horizon. It was a dark shape and it was traveling at speed. Heartbeats later, I could make out that it was a car. It was our ride out of here. I moved into the middle of the road and began to wave my arms. The car slowed and came to a halt. I lowered my arms and grinned at Lorna in relief. She smiled back as the driver and the passenger in the front seat climbed out and stood by the open doors. Both wore dark suits and shades. "Boy, are we pleased to see you," I said. "We need a ride out of here really bad. We can explain in the car." I started towards the back door, but the driver lifted his jacket to reveal a badge and holster. He said in a gravelly voice, "Federal agents, this is now a restricted zone and you two are detained." "What the?" I began to say. The passenger cut me off by shouting, "You will do what you're told." He moved towards me and produced a pair of handcuffs. "You don't understand. We're all in danger if we stay here." But he wasn't listening to me. He grabbed my wrist, and Lorna said, "They are here." Everything seemed slow then. The passenger was opening up the handcuffs and the driver was watching. There was a sneer on his face. I turned away from both of them and looked back at the edge of the woods, where dark eyes glinted with malevolent intent. Through the corner of my eye, I was aware that Lorna was inching away from the monsters. I forced myself to do the same. The passenger did not try and stop me. He was staring at the monsters as they shuffled into the light. He looked like he had frozen with the shock. The monsters were a vision conjured from the darkest of places and he was seeing them for the first time. So was the driver, but he was reacting by reaching into his holster. He unleashed a volley and the nearest monsters fell. They were a repulsive drop in an ocean of pain. Dozens more scrambled over the fallen bodies of their kin and threw themselves at the driver, drawn to him like scavengers to roadkill. The passenger finally came out of his daze and he drew. He took out one monster before he was overwhelmed. I saw his mouth open, but he didn't try to cry out in fear. One of the monsters had his throat gripped in its teeth, and it tore a chunk of flesh free. The passenger's final few moments of life were spent in mute terror, and the driver was lost to sight altogether under a groaning, writhing mass of the animated dead. And the monsters on the edge of the slaughter were turning to me. I looked around for Lorna, panicked again when I couldn't see her. But then I heard the car's engine kick into life and I saw that she was behind the wheel. "Get in!" And I did not need a second invitation. I made it into the passenger seat and was still pulling the door closed behind me as Lorna sped off. There was a monster in the road directly in front of us. It raised its arms and showed its drool-laced teeth. Lorna accelerated. The monster was thrown up by the impact, struck the windscreen, and then rolled away. I twisted around and looked through the back window. The monster that we had hit was struggling to its feet, and behind it, the rest of our former neighbors were shuffling along the road. One of them was holding a spine that had been stripped clean of flesh in its hand and dragging it along the ground. By my side, Lorna said, "There's no way they can catch us." The open road lay ahead of us. That should have meant the way was clear for us to find help from the authorities. Only 2 federal agents had just tried arresting us. I asked Lorna, "Do you think it's true what Doc Wilson said about the town being locked down to cover up a secret experiment?" Keeping her eyes fixed on the road, Lorna replied, "I honestly wish I could say no, but I just don't know anymore. If death is no longer the end of a physical form, then anything is possible. This is no longer the land of the free. It's the land of chaos and fear and unspeakable horror." As I considered her words, the sound of a helicopter filled the sky. A voice from above, distorted, crackled at us. "This is a restricted zone. Pull over to the side of the road." Lorna swore a stream of obscenities which translated as, "No way am I going to do that." I didn't think we had a choice. The road continued straight ahead, and we could not outrun a helicopter, especially one where the crew had 0 patience. It crackled overhead again. "Halt immediately or we will deploy fatal force." Lorna cussed again and turned the wheel sharply. The car left the road and we began plummeting through the woods, heading further away from our hometown. The sound of trees being shredded as the helicopter crew made good on their promise followed us as we jolted and rattled deeper into the undergrowth. Lorna swerved the wheel crazily to left and right to avoid tree trunks in our path, and I was convinced we were going to come crashing to a halt at any moment. A sickening jolt proved me right. The car had struck a tree. The front bonnet was trashed and smoke spiraled into the air. We both threw our doors open and started to stumble away. I had no idea where we were until we once more emerged from the woods. We were standing alongside the highway which had skirted our hometown. There was a small turnoff which took you into town. The highway was usually packed with fast-moving traffic, but at that moment in time, it was gridlocked in the direction of our hometown. The opposite lanes were empty. We stepped out of the woods close by a truck, and the driver was standing by his vehicle smoking a cigarette and scowling at the screen of a phone. He was a big guy with a beard and tattoos that ran up the side of his neck. Lorna approached him and asked, "What's happening?" The authorities have shut the road in both directions. They're saying there's been an explosion and the public needs to be kept away until the area is made safe. It's hogwash if you ask me." Lorna glanced at me and I could tell that we were thinking the same thing. Doc Wilson had been right. We were all pawns in a sick game being played by the powers that be. Until a few hours ago, on a sleepy summer's day in our hometown, we had believed that we were safe. Now we knew the truth. And this is my warning to you. Watch out for the signs because danger's close. Fear your neighbor and get ready to run. I've got an urban legend to tell y'all. It's an old ghost story that my family has been passing down for generations. Now, I just called it an urban legend, but it's totally a true story. Nothing can be verified indefinitely. That's what makes it a legend. But there are some clues that were left that indicate this actually happened, which I'll mention at the end. Here we go. This story starts off in Nevada, and that's all I'm going to say about the location. We don't know exactly what year, but it was sometime during the 1880s, maybe late 70s. Anyway, the locale of this little tale is in a small valley town. I wouldn't say more than about 20 to 25 people lived there at the time. I have not been able to verify this town's existence, but honestly, I can't imagine how many Lost Valley towns there were way out west in the early days. But according to legend, this town was buried on purpose. It starts on the night of a meteor shower. Now back then, they really didn't know what they were since they didn't have the news or the weather channel. But apparently, it was going on long enough that two guys, they were named Smokey and Billy, went up on the roof of the general store to keep watching it after everybody else had gotten bored. They're up there wondering how far away these shooting stars are, when they see one that was apparently so close that they could visibly see it in the sky above them. As in, they could make out the outline and see the tail and everything. In fact, one flew so close by they could actually feel the rush of wind as it blew by. They even witnessed it crash into the mountains with a huge explosion. It must have been a very small meteorite, since it didn't cause any massive shockwaves or leave any lasting impact, and that the general populace knows about anyway. The explosion boom brought the whole town outside. It was your typical western town, one main road with various buildings and so on, and everybody is out on the road with their torches talking about what had happened, who had seen it, and is it God Almighty himself coming down from heaven. Smokey and Billy tell everybody what they saw, and that one of the shooting stars might have crashed or otherwise landed in the nearby mountains. It looked like it had landed on a well-known to the mountain lake up near a small peak. But now, these mountains are miles away. It would take about a half day on horseback to get to the base of the mountains, but that is exactly what they decide on doing. Smokey and Billy are joined by their friends, Jack and Angeli, and the sheriff was going too. He was a real hard-nosed sheriff by how the story's been told. No nonsense, straight as an arrow, and probably had an awesome mustache. So, all these guys are excited about their little adventure, when the town doc has to go and almost ruin everything. Doc was obviously the smartest guy in town, and if you can picture a doc from any Western Shore movie that you've ever seen who seems to know everything, it's this guy. Anyway, he tells them that they need to be careful, because this thing came from space, and it could have some kind of harmful effects on humans, like toxic space fumes or spores or something. He also mentioned that it was doubtful that they would even find the actual crash site. It might look like it landed on the peak, but it could be much higher and inaccessible. The group doesn't pay any attention, and Smokey says that they'll bring Doc back a piece of the shrapnel. So the next day, they gather their crap and they head out. They're all armed, of course, and they're cowboys after all. And besides, this was Indian country. Anyway, it only takes about half the day to get to the mountain base where the trail starts. They might have actually been there sooner, but they didn't ride very hard. They enjoyed the open prairie and BSing with each other, and they weren't too cautious either. Not a single sign of any Indians. So they reached the mountain base and they start heading up the trails. And they could still ride their horses about halfway up the mountain before they had to go out on foot. These trails had been walked before, so there was a makeshift horse rail at the trailhead that someone made at some point in time where it got treacherous for horses. The trail got steep, but this particular area was pretty heavily wooded as well. So even if the trail wasn't as steep as it was, there was no way the horses could have made it through the woods. Since they didn't want to leave their horses here alone for too long, they decided to camp here for the night. They set up a campfire and they did the usual bullcrap people did. And they told some stories, ate food, and then they hit the sack. They woke up early the next morning and set out on the hard part of the trail. It was hard work getting up this trail, but boy, was it worth it to reach this lake they were headed to. Anyway, as they got closer and closer, Smokey, I think it was him, apparently looked up at one point and noticed the trees were getting shorter and the sun seemed to be getting brighter. "Hey, you guys, look up. Look at some of these trees. The goddamn tops have been sheared off." This gets the guys all excited and they stop and look up to take it in. Jack especially is all giddy about how close they must be getting. Angeli is the furthest back and apparently calls out, "Whoever gets there first, find a good rock to take back to the dock. That son of a bitch," jokingly. Now the peak where they were headed was kind of an oasis. There was a medium to large sized lake completely surrounded by the mountains and trees. There was only the one trail that led to this lake in the mountains. There would probably be some kind of a resort there nowadays if it was still accessible. Anyway, the meteor had indeed crashed exactly where they thought, right in the middle of this resort-like lake. Each one of the guys stopped dead in their tracks upon entering the clearing and seeing the destruction. They all mumble some kind of surprised expression. "Jesus H. Christ, driving a horse-drawn buggy," Smokey murmurs. "I guess we won't be coming back here anymore," the sheriff says. There was rubble littering the area from the impact. I mean, this place was trashed, completely destroyed, and the lake itself was finished, as one of the guys apparently stated. There were pieces of rock everywhere. There's trees destroyed and tipped over. There were broken trees still smoking from small fires that put themselves out. But what was the most interesting is what was in the lake itself. From what they recount, there was this large piece of metal sticking out of the lake, with a couple of smaller pieces near the top sticking out on either side. A couple guys started moving closer to the lake and the sheriff got all mad and safety oriented. "Everyone be careful now, goddammit," the sheriff says. "Watch out for sharp rocks. Don't pick up anything misshaped too much. Rocks can be sharp as knives." They moved up to the shoreline and everybody notices this large thing sticking out of the water. Someone, Billy will say, asks what it could be. They don't know that it's metallic at this point. Angeli was a blacksmith, so he mentioned, "It looks like some kind of metal." He picked up a nearby stone and he threw it at it. It hits the object with a ping. It's definitely metallic. Jack is leaning over trying to look into the water. He blurts out, "Holy shit, guys, I can see something further down in the water it's connected to." They all peer into the lake where he is pointing, and sure enough, the metal shaft was connected to an even larger object deep underneath. It was too deep though, and the water was murky from all the dirt and rubble the crash had caused. All they could make out was a silhouette. Billy was way too curious about this. He was like, "Well, let's swim down there. I bet we can get a better look before we have to come up for air." There's a couple murmurs of agreement and a couple of the guys start loosening some of their clothes like they're going to dive in. The sheriff gets all pissed again, and it's a good thing he was there though. "Now wait just a goddamn minute." He paused and he surveyed the water. "Nobody go in the water. Look at all these fish that are belly up." Nobody had noticed with all the excitement of the destruction and the mysterious metal shaft. There was dead fish floating in the water. A lot of them, mostly concentrated near the shaft. Jack is surprised. "What in the hell?" While everybody is focused on the fish, he notices that the water is messed up too. "Look at the water, it's like something's in it." They all looked a little closer and sure enough, the water looked weird. There was like a discoloration to it. In all the excitement, they hadn't noticed it even though they were just looking in the water trying to see what was down there. Now with the advent of technology, the description of water has changed a little bit. I think the easiest way for me to describe how it looked is if you think about water and oil mixing. You kind of get like a rainbow hue, only this wasn't as strong. They're all kind of farting around on the shore when Billy sees a turtle in the sand a few feet away, crawling around near the shoreline. Look at the turtle, it's alive. He bent down to pick it up. It was a smaller turtle, about the size of a softball. Don't touch it, the sheriff says gruffly. It's too late though. Billy picks it up and finds it has a coating of whatever was in the water. Smokey gets all pissed off this time. God damn it now, look, you got that shit all over your hands. Billy was holding the turtle in his left hand while he used his right to make fists and run his fingers over the thin substance. Apparently, it had a silvery hue to it out of the water. He describes the feeling to the other guys, saying that it feels slippery. It doesn't burn or hurt at all. Angeli doesn't like this either, and he yells at Billy too. Don't touch your goddamn mouth. In fact, just put the turtle down and wipe your hands. Doc says don't touch your eyes or mouth if you get that shit on your hands until you wash it off. Does anybody got any blasted soap? Smokey says he does, but didn't have time to get it out of the bag. Billy yells out suddenly, probably scaring the ever-loving crap out of everybody. Ow! This son of a gun turtle just bit me. The turtle had bitten the part of his hand between his thumb and index finger, the soft webbing that some people call it. Concerned and annoyed, Angeli says, I don't know why you picked it up. There's snappers in these parts, you know. Smokey disagrees. That ain't no snapper. It's way too small. By this point, Billy had thrown the turtle down in the sand. Gosh, it drew blood, he says, showing his hand to everybody. Now personally, I was always skeptical of the turtle bite part since turtles don't have teeth. But apparently, if a normal river turtle bites hard enough, its beak could be capable to drawing blood. They're all looking at the hand and Jack mentions what a pissed off little turtle it must have been. The sheriff is the only one looking at the turtle laying in the sand. That turtle looks like crap, he says gruffly. Look at him. Everybody gathers around where the turtle is. It was on its back, writhing around in the sand for a few seconds, before it corrected itself. It didn't look like a normal turtle anymore. Apparently the look of the turtle has changed over the years, and depending on who's telling the story. But either way, I guess its normal green and brown hues were gone. It was like a grayish color almost, an ugly looking gray. Smokey makes a conjecture about the way the turtle looks. It looks like it's dead. Billy gets all upset. Well, it's obviously not. He holds up his hand again. He wasn't bleeding so bad to speak, but there was enough to see that the turtle had got him good. Angeli gets all bent up and out of shape about cleaning the wound again, saying, We have got to get that stuff washed off quick. Get water from a canteen and get that soap over here. They patched Billy up and spent the next couple hours looking around. And they gathered some rocks, looked at, and climbed destroyed trees, and tried to get a look at whatever was in the water from every possible angle without getting too close. More turtles were popping up on the beach and the guys were kicking them back in. Also, a few waterfowls or birds of some kind had flown over the area and made their way towards the water, but none of them had landed. I guess they stopped dead in their tracks a couple feet above the water, flapped their wings and then hovered in place and then flew off. Like they somehow knew or sensed that the water was bad news. Somebody makes a comment about it, and Smokey chides Billy by saying the birds are smarter than he was, since they knew that the water was garbage. They decide that it's time to go, so they stand around discussing their plan of action. They decide to try and get home that day and get Billy to the dock. They'll be going downhill this time, and they'll ride a lot harder home than they did on the way in. The sheriff isn't so sure though. Looks like clouds are rolling in. It don't look like rain, but there won't be any moon. We're not going to make it home. Let's get back to the horses and camp there. They gather their stuff and they start down. They actually did make pretty good time at first, but then Billy starts to lag. Eventually he stops and bends over to catch his breath. Smokey asked if he's okay. Billy shakes his head saying, I don't know. I forgot where I was going for a second there, and now I can't catch my breath. Yeah, you can probably guess where this is heading. Anyway, on account of Billy's newfound lethargy, they didn't make great time back to the horses. It almost took double what it should have going down the hill. So they get back to the horses and Angeli says Billy looks like hell. That turtle, it had to have some kind of disease and now Billy's infected. He still thinks they should make a run for home that night. We're not gonna make it down these wooded hills in the dark, the sheriff reiterates. And if we did, we need to cross the plains home. We'd never see an Indian attack coming if we're out there. Jack and Smokey both agree, so they set up camp again and they make a fire. The night comes and sure enough, it's pitch black without the moon. They're all kind of hanging out, sitting around the fire, and Billy just keeps putting on more clothes. It wasn't a very cold night, but even then Billy was sweating up a storm. It looked like he had pure sweat on his face, and like somebody had dumped a bucket of water on him. He ain't gonna last the dang night, Angeli said, pointing his stick with a hot dog on it at Billy. I'm telling ya, we should have tried to get him home. There were mumbling and murmurs from the rest of the guys on what they should have done. At this point, Billy kind of stands up and steps away from the fire, and then lays himself on the ground. Apparently it looks like he just fell, but he had laid on his blanket down on the ground like he was going to bed, so nobody really knew what to think. Night, Smokey says without turning away from the fire. The guys stay by the fire, but after only a few minutes, Billy starts moving on the ground. He rolls back and forth for a few seconds and then full on starts convulsing. Jesus H. Smokey yells, throwing a sausage down. The rest of the guys all huddled around Billy. None of them even knew what a seizure was, so they didn't know what to do. Help him, for Christ's sake, Jack yells. Hold him down, and the sheriff hollers. He's gonna hit his head. And for your information, never tried to hold down or prevent movement from somebody seizing, but like I said, they didn't know what was going on. After what seemed like an hour, but it was only a couple of minutes, and Billy stops seizing, lets out a raspy groan which probably let all the air out of his lungs, and then he stops moving. Billy! Angeli slaps his face. Jesus Christ, Smokey says. He's stone cold. He was holding Billy's non-bitten hand. After a minute or two of trying to wake Billy up, the sheriff speaks up. He's dead. Nobody can believe it. He didn't look good, Jack stammers. He looks like that gosh dang turtle, Angeli says gravely. I guess Billy was looking pale, not so much gray I guess. But over the years of telling this tale, and each generation makes their own conjectures. But I like to say that Billy looked like the life had left him before he died. You're not supposed to look that color as soon as you die is a thing. It takes time for life to fade out of somebody's body after they die. The sheriff lets out a long sigh. Alright, listen up. He was fine this morning, and that turtle bit him, and now he's dead. Nobody touched the body. If you did, wash your hands right now. Wrap him up in a blanket and slide him away from where we'll be sleeping. We need to get his body to the doc for an autopsy. They cleaned up dinner before messing with Billy's body. They found a nice spot under a tree away from the camp to stash the body. Smokey and Sheriff were the ones that had moved him. They each grabbed a tuft of blanket, parts which hadn't touched Billy, and they slid him over to the tree. Poor son of a gun, Smokey said as they stood over him. They turned around, but they didn't walk away yet. Any next of kin you know of? The sheriff asked. Before Smokey could answer, there was a growl behind him. I guess it was guttural, savage, like feral even. And then another. I guess Smokey and the sheriff stopped talking as soon as they heard the growl, and they kind of stood there looking at each other without saying anything for a couple of seconds. After the second growl, they slowly continued turning around to find Billy sitting up. They're kind of just standing there looking baffled, not sure what to think for a few seconds, before Billy snarls or growls and then lunges forward. He moves fast. He's on his feet in a second. What the? Is all Smokey can get out before the sheriff lets out a pissed off, painful howl. Ugh! Is all the sheriff can muster, probably trying to say something, my guess. Billy's got the sheriff's left hand in his mouth. He's got it by the fatty part in the outside of his hand, below the pinky. Sheriff had gotten his hand up, otherwise Billy might have gotten his neck straight away. Jesus Christ, you guys! Smokey is yelling as he tries to get Billy off the sheriff by hitting his head with his hand. Jack and Angeli come rushing over. Holy Christ! Angeli shouts. Him and Jack also start hitting Billy. He ain't dead? Jack is yelling. Billy lets go of the sheriff at this point, and Sheriff staggers away from the area holding his hand. The other three guys are standing there looking at Billy in shock. His chin and lower jaw are soaked and dripping in red blood. His skin had absolutely no color whatsoever, and the look in his eyes is so wild it's like the 1,000-yard stare from the devil himself. Billy rushed at the other three guys at this point. With a raspy growl, and they scatter in different directions. Don't let him bite you, Smokey yells. It almost sounds kind of funny. Billy is running after anything that moves, and Smokey, Jack, and Angeli are running all over the camp to avoid him. Each guy lets out a screech whenever they see Billy is locked onto them, and the horses don't like it either. Amid all the commotion, they're rearing up and bucking, and lucky for them, by the time Billy notices them and he starts going after them, they've broken off their horse rail and they're on their way down the trail. The guys gather by the fire to catch their breath when Billy turns around and starts running back at them. There's a sudden boom that most likely causes all three men to crap their pants. Billy stops. The boom continues, and the last one puts Billy on his back. Sheriff comes walking out of the shadows with a gun drawn in front of him. Sheriff reloads as the other guys got their own guns out of their sleeping bags. He dead? Jack asks. Of course he's dead. Angeli returns. Yeah, well, we thought that before. Jack reiterates. Just as everybody calms down, Billy starts to move again. That's impossible, Smokey said as Billy stands up. Hit him again, the sheriff hollers. They all blast him and Billy goes down again. The sheriff doesn't empty this time though. He walks over to Billy and just stands over him for a few seconds. And sure enough, Billy sits up again and the sheriff blows his head off. Everybody's quiet for what feels like a year. That did it, Smokey says finally. They all gather around Billy's body. Doc isn't going to believe this, Jack says. Well, he'll have to, the sheriff says. 4 men telling him the same story, and once he gets a look at the body, there should not be any doubt. If anything, the autopsy will show something made Billy sick. Smokey is looking grim once he realizes something. He starts. I'm not saying we need to shoot anybody, but... I already thought of that, the sheriff says. He was standing over the fire now, running his hand over it and wincing every few passes. He was cauterizing his bite. That's pretty hardcore. I'm bit. That sick turtle bit Billy and he turned into some kind of demon. And now Billy bit me. What do we do? Angeli asked. The weather hasn't changed. Still way too dark to risk all our lives trying to get me to the dock tonight, the sheriff says. So, here's what we're gonna do. He bends down and he picks up some rope out of his gear. "Smokey, you tie some pretty mean knots. Tie me to that tree there, and if I end up like Billy, my growling and rasping should wake you all up and I won't be able to bite anybody." "I don't think I'll be able to sleep tonight," Smokey says. "You have to get some," the sheriff says. "First light, we have to be gone." So the guys bag Billy up again in his sleeping bag and pull him away from the camp. Angeli lets out a long sigh. "We're gonna have to drag his ass all the way back home. And that's why we have to leave as soon as the sun starts rising," the sheriff says as he sits down next to his tree. It was a smaller tree, small enough to wrap a rope around Sheriff's torso, and around the tree trunk a couple of times and knot it off. Smokey asks if it's too tight and Sheriff says that it's just tight enough. If things go bad, the sheriff doesn't want himself to be able to wiggle free. Everybody says their good nights and they try to fall asleep. It's hard to say if anybody actually got much sleep, but Smokey is up first. He jolts awake nervously and finds the sun is on its way up. The clouds have cleared out, so he wakes everybody else up. They all kind of panic and they look over at the sheriff. He's sitting there still tied up, with his head slumped down on his chest. "He dead?" Jack asks. Sheriff raises his head and looks at the guys. "I ain't dead yet." "How do you feel?" Smokey asks him. "My hand hurts like hell," the sheriff returns. "It's been hours," Angeli says. "And by this time, Billy was looking like hell. You look like you still have some color." "Maybe it didn't transfer from Billy," Jack offers. The sheriff tells them they don't have time to figure it out now, and that's the doc's job. So they gather the crap up and they head down to the trail, dragging Billy behind them tied up in his sleeping bag. They have a stroke of luck here, something they sorely needed. Dragging Billy downhill made it easier, but when they get down the trail, they find Sheriff's horse just hanging out a couple 100 feet out on the prairie, drinking from a small ditch. He whistles and it comes running and they strap Billy over him. They head home as fast as they can, and they get there in late afternoon. When they get back, they enter town down the main street and there's a couple people here and there. Some shop owners standing out in front of their place enjoying the weather, etc. The general store owner comes running up to them and he's like, "Where the hell's Billy?" "He's dead." The sheriff returns quickly. "We need to get to the dock right now." By now, more people are popping out wherever they were hiding. They get up to the dock's place with a train of people in tail, all wondering what the hell is going on and not getting any answers. Was it Indians? Was it an animal? Did he shoot himself on accident? Doc hears the commotion and comes outside as they approach. He's looking at the horse, and knowing full well there's a dead body in the sleeping bag. And then he sees the sheriff's bandaged up, bloody red hand. Inside, Doc starts in on them as they put their sleeping bag up on the exam table. "I told you it was a bad idea to go up there. What happened?" He starts undoing the sleeping bag. The sheriff stops him. "Hold on. Before you look, you need to hear what happened first." So they tell him the whole thing. Of course he doesn't believe them. "Now I told you there could be a couple toxins up there. Some kind of space dust you inhaled that made you hallucinate. I sure hope I don't have to call the state marshals to start a murder investigation." "Well, don't take our word for it, god dang it," Smokey says. "Here you go." He whips open the sleeping bag, Doc had untied. Doc jolted and jumped back. After a few seconds of staring, he starts getting closer again. "He looks like Swiss cheese, doesn't he?" Angeli says dryly. "He bit the hell out of my hand. Damn near might have torn out my jugular if I hadn't gotten up in time. I made a judgment call afforded to me as a lawman. He tried biting everybody else, so I put him down. And then he got back up. People just don't get back up after getting shot, Doc says, not taking his eyes off of Billy's corpse. Well, he did, Jack says. And no, we didn't have any alcohol up there. Nobody even brought any. The headshot stopped him for good, Sheriff says, pointing to the huge hole in Billy's head. Doc kind of snaps out of his trance. Okay, so a turtle bit him, and by night, he was this? Yep, the sheriff says. There was something in that water. The turtle was covered in it. I'm gonna need that turtle to find out if it was carrying some kind of infection, the doc says. Doc and sheriff start playing the whole who has more authority card. Nobody's going back up there, the sheriff says. It's too dangerous. Whatever that turtle had, it's safe to say Billy did too. The doc is staring at Billy again. It's like he's been dead for weeks. This happened overnight? Doc, it bit Sheriff too, Smokey says. He kind of says it with dread in his voice. Doc checks out his hand. That's quite a bite. Nice work on cauterizing it. I've got some antibiotics to start you on. Not sure if they'll help enough. The rest of the guys murmur quietly. Huh, I thought it looked worse yesterday. Smokey ponders. Why doesn't he look sick? Jack asked. Doc goes into a long spiel. There could be several reasons. I said the antibiotic may not help, because it sounds like whatever was transferred to Billy is probably viral. A couple things can happen when it comes to any disease, bacterial or viral. 99% of people will get infected, get sick and show signs, and be contagious and fall prey to whatever the disease causes, up to death depending what it is. The other 1% could be 3 different things. First, you could straight up be immune to the disease. For whatever reason, it's not able to overcome your immune system. You won't show signs and you won't be sick, and you won't be contagious. I hope he's immune, Angeli interrupts. Doc doesn't miss a beat. The second thing is, you could be a carrier. That means you're infected, but you don't feel sick and you don't show symptoms. You are still contagious, however. How will we know if he's immune or carrying? Smokey asked. I'll have to do some blood tests. I'll probably have to run cultures, which takes time. What's the third thing that can happen? The sheriff asked. Well, we don't have to worry about that one since you would already be showing. But the last thing that can happen is the pathogen completely mutates your DNA. Once it enters your body, within hours your body could start changing physically. Muscle tissue overgrowth, skeletal growth or shrinkage, severe decrease or increase of mental function. The list of physical changes could be endless. So, until we know, I need to act like I'm the carrier, the sheriff says. That's correct, the doc returns. Don't be using the public outhouse. Only prepare your own food and keep that hand wrapped tight. Doc says that he needs to go home and stay there, and run his office off his front porch. So they all leave the doc's place as he gets ready to do the autopsy on Billy. Doc only has one nurse with him, but she was more like an assistant than an actual nurse. They glove up and get their table ready. It's at this point that the shit really starts, and honestly, it was a complete freak accident. At this point, Doc instructs the nurse to remove Billy's teeth for dental records, while he examines what's left of Billy's brain. Doc has a suspicion that whatever made Billy sick specifically affected his brain, given that he apparently went insane and tried to attack everyone. Doc was also interested in the brain because that was what eventually stopped Billy for good when he was shot there. Okay, the doc starts. So, his brain appears to be covered in a foreign substance of some kind. Most of the blood is coagulated and dried, but this appears to still be moist. I can verify that it's silver in hue. He's telling the nurse so she will be able to help him write his notes. So this next part is what screws everything up. The doc is poking around the brain and he must have hit a nerve of some kind. Whatever he hits causes Billy's jaw to close hard really quick. And you remember what the nurse is doing. She's trying to pry his teeth out. Despite being dead, Billy manages to bite the nurse's finger hard. She lets out a cry and the doc gets all worried. "It didn't break skin, did it?" he asked hurriedly. They both make a huge mistake here. The nurse lies and says that it didn't break skin when it did. And the doc also doesn't ask to look at it. He can't seem to pry himself away from Billy's carcass. The nurse says that she's going to just go wash her hand really quick to be safe and sound, and the doc lets her. She comes back with a band-aid on her finger, but since the gloves they were wearing were opaque, Doc doesn't notice. The doc moves on to the torso and cuts Billy open. There is silvery stuff everywhere. It was definitely in his bloodstream. I think I might be able to isolate the sample. They wrap up what they're doing after a couple of hours and the nurse goes home while the doc writes his notes. It's dusk by now, so everybody will be hitting the sack shortly enough. But the doc is up all night though. More on that later. And that was also the last night in that town's existence. Angley, Jack, and Smokey had gone out looking for their horses after leaving Doc's, but they didn't have any luck. They decided to shack up in a small hut a couple miles outside of town. It was getting late and the person who had owned that house had died a couple of months prior. Anyway, they wake up early before the sun is even up, and they decide the horses are long gone, so they just head back to town. The sun is starting to come up when they reach town, and they can see before they even get there. A lot of people are already up and walking around. Smokey thinks that this is strange, saying, "And I thought we were up early. Seems like the whole town is already up and at 'em." And they get to town and the sun is up, but it was just dark enough that they didn't notice what was going on. Jack sees a guy that he recognizes and calls out, "Hey, Mac." Mac stops and turns around, and the three guys all stop dead in their tracks. Half of Mac's face is gone and all that's left is half muscle tissue and half of it straight down to the bone. And the rest of his body isn't much better. He starts shambling towards the guys. Not a full-scale sprint, but not exactly slow either. "Oh shit, it's Brad," Smokey calls out. Nobody else has time to call out. Smokey and Angley retreat while Jack stands his ground and shoots Mac. "His head!" Angley yells. Mac goes down with a boom. Everybody else on the street turns their attention to the guys and starts shambling towards them. Some were missing all assortments of limbs, from fingers to hands to arms. Most were missing large chunks of flesh. Apparently one in particular had no flesh at all on their head, and it was just a skeleton head on a decayed body. "The whole town?" Smokey yells. They all shoot off a couple of rounds before realizing that the whole town is gone. Now they don't know anything about what had happened during the autopsy, but remember the nurse. Yeah, she went off somewhere and died during the night. The bad news was that she was living in the town inn, for the time being since a lantern had tipped over and started a small fire where she lived. Anyway, nobody knows who she bit first, but you know how it goes. She ate someone, they came back and they ate somebody else. The whole town is probably gone within the hour. "Run!" Angley yells. They scatter as the horde approaches. Smokey and Angley duck into the saloon while Jack disappears somewhere else. "What do we do?" Angley shrieks. I don't know. Don't make any noise, just shut the hell up," Smokey says. It was too late though. A couple of zombies were already heading towards the saloon. "Upstairs!" Smokey yells. They hear a couple gunshots outside, probably from Jack. They start upstairs and almost get there when the door to the room at the top of the stairs flies open. and a zombie snarls and tackles Angela, who was going first. Angela and the zombie falls back, while Smokey reacts and backs up against the banister. They tumble down to the bottom of the stairs. It's a grisly sight. The zombie starts eating Angela right away. He hits it a couple of times and he tries to get a shot off, but by this time, a bunch more zombies had burst through the saloon swinging double door and they start at it too. Smokey gets upstairs and he realizes that he's cornered, so he steps over the railing and he jumps down to the bar. He quickly jumps down behind it. What has been described as Angela getting eaten alive sounds pretty awful. Smokey sees a zombie a couple feet away, with an arm and another one has his leg nearby. The screams before being cut off and a gurgling grunt sound like something you simply can't unhear. So Smokey is hiding behind the bar, wondering what the hell he was going to do. It sounds like the zombies had picked Angela clean, though they seem to just be shambling around. It's like they forgot that he was there. Smokey morbidly thinks to himself, Angela isn't going to look too good when he rises back up. Smokey hid for what seemed like an eternity when he heard loud footsteps coming from the doorway. It was definitely hooves. He pops up and he sees the sheriff riding his whole damn horse into the saloon, a bunch of zombies behind him. He's got a shotgun on him and he blasts the two zombies nearest to him. They were close enough together to get them both and their heads basically explode. He gets a second shotty blast off and he throws the whole gun at the nearby zombie. It was a double barrel, so he only had 2 shots. Anyway, this catches everybody else's attention, but he already has his pistol out. He gets maybe 3 more before the horde behind him catches up. His horse freaks out and bucks him off, so Sheriff crawls on the floor under some tables away from the zombies. It's kind of sad. He's able to escape because they get his horse. Out the back! Sheriff yells at Smokey, and they scurry out of the back door. What happened? Smokey yells. I don't know. I came into town to see the doc and I found everybody was like Billy. Doc's got his place locked up tight. The curtains drawn and everything. We need to find Jack, the Smokey says. He's on his own, the sheriff says. We need help and we need it now. Huh? Smokey says. Sheriff quickly explains the help he wants to get is from the friendly Indians nearby, a couple miles southeast. Which tribe it was has changed over the years, but most people seem to think that it was the Paiute. Smokey agrees that they need the help, so they sneak down to the south end of town. Sheriff leads them down to the doc's place, where he has Angela's horse tied up with it to a horse rail. There's a bag laying on the ground with a rope tied around it connected to the saddle. The bag clearly has a body in it. I found Angela's horse screwing around on my property this morning. I brought it in and I tied Jones up to him after I had to kill him. I want to show those Indians exactly what we're up against, the sheriff explains. They mount up and ride away as a bunch of zombies are headed towards them. Once they're in the clear, Smokey asks, You really think that they'll help us? I've actually talked to them quite a few times, the sheriff says. They're a spiritual people. They have rich folklore. The way they talk about their ancestry. I bet they have some kind of story dealing with the dead. If anything, I'm sure they'll have some warriors they can spare to help us kill these damn things. Smokey doesn't argue. They ride out a couple miles until they come across a scouting party. The village is a short ways past them. It seems like one of the Indians recognized Sheriff. He waves at him and the Indian motions with his hand to his buddies and starts riding out to meet them. Sheriff talks to his friend, who comes to be known as Buffalo, about what is going on. He doesn't show Buffalo what's in his bag, but he agrees to take them to the chief. Now we call him Buffalo because his name was something Indian sounding, like rides with buffalo or runs with bison or something. But apparently Smokey called him Buffalo/horse on accident at some point because he forgot his name. And plus Buffalo horse is a lot easier to write than rides with buffalo, so there you go. Anyway, they get to the chief's teepee and Sheriff and Smokey wait outside a minute and untie Jones from the horse. Buffalo Horse comes out and says the chief will see them. They go inside, dragging Jones behind them, and they see the chief and what must be his counsel all sitting on the ground. The chief says something in their native language. "Why have you come and what do you bring with you?" The person sitting next to the chief translates. "We've got ourselves a little problem." Sheriff begins. The guy translates. "The dead have come back to life. We need your help stopping it." The translator looks surprised, but almost reluctantly translates. The chief appears to ponder the statement while giving Sheriff a steely gaze. "Look here," Sheriff says, unveiling Jones. Jones raises his head and snarls. He wasn't actually dead. The consul and everybody else in the teepee jump to their feet and let out murmurs of shock and surprise. One member of the consul yells loudly something in their language, and then rushes over and buries his tomahawk into Jones' head. "I thought you said he was dead," Smokey whispers to Sheriff. "I lied," Sheriff whispers back. "We've got a town full of these," Sheriff says. The council all deliberate. It seems like they might be telling the chief to tell Sheriff and Smokey to go screw themselves. The chief speaks and the translator translates. "You will take Buffalo Horse and Fish River with you. They will help you kill them and make sure none are left." And of course his name is in Fish River. He was the top fisherman in the tribe, so his name is related to that. I wanted to say it was swims with fish or runs with the river, but either way I don't know for sure, and once again, Fish River is a lot easier to write out. I hope nobody's offended by these nicknames. So, Buffalo Horse and Fish River leave to gather their weapons. The chief says something to Sheriff and Smokey in English as they're leaving the tent. "Beware the bite of the dead man." "Thank you," Sheriff says, not just for that tidbit of information, but for their help as a whole. "Beware the bite was the first damn thing that we learned," Smokey says once they're outside. "Yeah, I told you they'd have some kind of knowledge about this. You see, that one guy went straight for the head." Buffalo Horse and Fish River ride over. "All right, man," Sheriff says. "Looks like we've got a town to clean up." The Indians lend Smokey a spare horse and the four of them ride back towards town. They get about a mile from town when they start noticing some stragglers. There's a couple of townsfolk who had shambled out of town and are just lost wandering the open land. Buffalo Horse and Fish River take the opportunity to show what they can do. Buffalo Horse uses his bow and pulls off a miraculous headshot from about 50 yards out. Fish River rides up to his guy and smokes him in the head with some kind of club, the force of which knocks the whole rotting head off the shoulders. Anyway, they make a startling discovery at this point. A little past these two stragglers, they find a cow just standing in the middle of nowhere. Its entire side missing flesh with its ribcage and half of its guts on the ground next to it. After putting it down, they realize that they're going to have to sweep the entire countryside of all around town, not just of zombies wandering off, but any animals they happen to eat along the way. They decide to split up and do a wide circle around town to clean up anything they find, before moving into town proper. A lot of people's houses they decide to clear first too. Most of them were single story and only a room or two. Smokey and Fish River and Sheriff and Buffalo Horse. They start at the south and ride their way to the north side of town. They find a couple stragglers that they put down, and Sheriff ends up finding his horse as well, half limping after some kind of desert rodent to eat it. It was probably nice for Sheriff to put him down for good, in a morbid kind of way. After checking the outskirts of town and cleaning up a few stragglers, they're now ready to head into town. They come up from the north side and are immediately met with about 6 or 7 zombies right off the bat. Buffalo and Fish are quiet about it, but Smokey up and just blows somebody's head off, which obviously attracts everyone. They get off their horses and slap their ass and holler to get them to run off for the time being, so that they don't get eaten. And then they duck into the inn since it's the nearest building. Smokey grabs the cavalry sword that's hanging on the wall as a decoration. Immediately inside the building, there's two zombies standing at the main desk, which Fish promptly slices one up while Smokey uses his new sword on the other. "Might as well clear this building first," Sheriff says. "Check every room." They head upstairs and find most of the rooms empty. The room at the end of the hallway has two zombies trying to get in it. They're just walking into the door repeatedly and hitting it softly with their hands, all the while growling and hissing. "Hey, is that Doc's nurse?" Smokey points out one of them. Remember, they don't know that she started it. Anyway, the zombies hear his voice and turn around and hiss, then shamble towards them. Buffalo chucks his tomahawk and takes down the nurse, and Sheriff uses his Bowie knife on the other one. "Is somebody out there?" A voice calls from inside of the room. The guys all look at each other. "Yeah," Sheriff returns. "Hey, is that Jack?" Smokey asked excitedly. "Yeah." They hear what sounds like Jack moving a bunch of stuff away from the door. The door opens a minute later to a relieved Jack. "It felt like I'd been in here for days. Hey, you brought some help," he says, referring to the Indians. There's no time to celebrate. The zombies who noticed the guys go into the inn are now all shambling in through the entryway. "Oh shit," Jack says. "Everybody downstairs," Sheriff orders. They get back to the staircase, which has a large open section to the floor below with a banister. And it's like a cafeteria with all the groans, hisses, and snarls down below. Zombies then notice the guys start trying to climb the stairs. It's pretty gross. Flesh hanging on the bones by a thread. Bones completely showing. People clambering around, dragging their entrails behind them. It's not a pretty picture. "Light 'em up," Sheriff says. He opens fire. At this point, most of the zombies know that they're here, so who cares about the noise? And plus, they've created a decent choke point for themselves. Buffalo and Fish are using their bows while Sheriff, Smokey, and Jack start shooting. Buffalo is closest to the staircase and he takes one or two down with his knife and his tomahawk that are able to climb the stairs. They wait a few moments after killing what seemed like the last one. "Okay, it looks like that wave is over. We'll head to the saloon and the general store next," Sheriff says. And so they head downstairs, carefully stepping over the rotted corpses and meet outside. "Burn the building," Fish says. "It'll destroy their corpses and the sickness that they bring." "Are we gonna have to burn the whole town down?" Smokey says sadly. "We burn it all," Sheriff says as he goes back into the inn. He comes out with a lit oil lantern. "All traces of this have to go," he says. He tosses the lantern into the inn and it shatters, starting a fire. The nearby dead bodies go up almost immediately. "We burn this town to the ground and any bodies along with it. We'll find a new place to live. We can head to Carson City and find something out that way." The general store was destroyed inside, and the rags toppled over and bloodstains on the floor everywhere. But the only one in there was the shopkeeper. The saloon had about 3 or so zombies in it. They were left over from Smokey and Sheriff's daring escape earlier. They found a couple zombies outside, yet that they had to be dragged in to be burned with the buildings. "Looks like Doc's place is about the only one left standing," Jack says. He's surveying what was once their town. A couple of the larger buildings are still ablaze, while some of the smaller ones have gone out already. They get to Doc's place and they find the door locked and curtains still drawn. "Doc!" Smokey calls out. He finds a window with a curtain not pulled down and puts his face in the glass to try and look in. "I can't see shit in here. Where the hell is he at?" "Doc!" Sheriff calls out loudly, banging hard on the door. "All right, break it down," he says after a pause. They force their way in. Doc's place is a 2-room building. The main area is where he sees patients, and then in the back there's a doorway to where his bedroom is at. They have a look around, and unless Doc is in his bedroom, he's nowhere to be found. "Holy shit," Jack says. He's standing next to Doc's exam table. Billy's body is still lying on it, completely sliced to hell. "It looks like you went at Billy like he was a ham. Opened him up damn near everywhere," Smokey says. "And look at these poor things," Jack says. He motions to a cage on the table with a few dead mice in it. "Those dead mice look like hell. I bet they were infected. How the hell would that happen if they were in the cage?" Smokey ponders. Sheriff tries the door to Doc's bedroom. It's locked, so he knocks on it lightly. "Doc." "Look here," Buffalo says. "His writings." He holds up what appears to be Doc's journal. "Hey," Smokey says loudly. "Does he say if Sheriff is immune or whatever?" Sheriff takes the journal and begins leafing through. It's a small diary, so not a ton is written on each page. "No, he doesn't have much about me in here," the sheriff says. "Well, what the hell has he been doing?" Jack asks. Sheriff is reading a page. "He isolated some samples of that silvery stuff in the water. It says here that it was all over Billy's insides." Here are a few of the journal entries that came out of Doc's journal. Entry 1. "Whatever this material is that has affected the patient's body appears to be organic in nature. As near as I can tell with all my medical training, it's a bodily fluid of some kind, though where it originated from, I do not know. Looking at a sample under the microscope, it does not appear to be a pathogen at all, despite behaving like one. Transfers from bites, etc. I have never seen or heard anything like it. I have to get up to that lake to see that water and that object the men spoke about." "So we went to the mountain?" Smokey asked. "No," the sheriff says bluntly. He keeps reading. Entry 2. "I injected one of my mice with the compound several hours ago. It died. Later I left for supper, and when I came back, it was alive again, although now it was completely rabid and insane. I attempted to euthanize it by injecting poison, and it had no effect, though I did not expect it to. Only after using a scalpel to pierce the head and brain did the subject cease. Whatever this foreign substance is, it seems to concentrate in the brain of whatever creature it affects." "There's more," the sheriff says. Entry 3. "I tried something new since another experiment ended in failure. I poisoned another mouse and I waited for death to set in. I then injected a dose of the substance an hour after it had died. 10 minutes later, the mouse started to move. Only this time when it woke up, it was not insane. It appeared to be perfectly normal. I euthanized it and I did an autopsy. The substance had overrun the mouse's insides as before, but it had regenerated its blood flow and bodily activities. Its organs, heart, lungs, brain, it looked fully functional. No signs of decay or atrophy that would have occurred after death. If I could unlock this substance, this could be the greatest medical discovery in history. A possible end to sickness or death. It's unimaginable. I must keep working. I do hope the sheriff is still alive. I may have squandered the perfect test subject." "So he's in here performing experiments?" Jack asks. "Does he know what the hell is going on out there?" Sheriff turns the page. "He knew," he says. It says right here. He read another passage. Entry 4. The town is gone. I hear the screams. It must be my nurse. I should have asked to see her finger. All I can do now is stay quiet and not attract any of their attention. I must unlock how this substance works. I attempted to repeat my successful experiment and it did not work. The same result in an undead mouse. The regenerative property of the substance only seems to work in the brain when it fails, and it only restores function on the most primitive of levels. Why did the sheriff in mouse number 4's body appear to accept this substance? So then, he is here, Smokey asked. Doc, Smokey yells loudly. We got a problem, Sheriff says. He sets the book down on the table. He injected himself. What? With that crap? Jack asks, flabbergasted. Smokey picks up the book and looks at it himself. His last passage, Sheriff begins. He goes on about how he has to figure it out, how he's going to inject himself and how he has to feel it work. He also planned on injecting some medicinal things of his own in hopes that it would counteract the failure. We need to find him now, Buffalo says. All right, kick it down, Jack says, walking towards Doc's bedroom. They heard a crash from the room and Jack stops dead in his tracks a few feet from the door. There's a few loud thuds, followed by a deep, guttural growl. Much louder and deeper than anything they've heard before. What in the bloody hell was that? Smokey asks. He's changed, Sheriff says. That sure doesn't sound like those other... Smokey starts. He doesn't get to finish his sentence. A gigantic creature smashes through the door, taking most of the wall with it. It has to be nearly 7 feet tall and bulkier than a semi-truck. It scoops up Jack like he weighs no more than a cotton ball and crumbles him up like a piece of paper. The sound of snapping bones goes on for what seemed like ever, and blood and guts are oozing out of the crumpled heap that was Jack as the creature throws it on the ground. Smokey and Sheriff get shots off, but its hide is so thick there are nothing but annoying mosquito bites to it. Now there's a couple of ways I can try to give you a mental picture of what this creature is supposed to look like. If you're familiar at all with the Left 4 Dead franchise, you know what the tank is. If you don't know what that is, then you at least know who the Incredible Hulk is. Like I said, it's at least 7 feet tall. Its arms are twice as long as a man should be, and they're bigger than tree trunks. And its neck was nearly gone due to the overgrowth of bone and muscle. Anyway, the creature rushes the center of the room and raises both arms to try and smash the guys. Sheriff, Buffalo, and Fish hightail it outside, but Smokey has to dive out of the way as the creature destroys the exam table and Billy's body. Each step the creature takes sounds like thunder on the wood floor. Now when the creature raised its arm to smash, they went through the ceiling, which is probably what saved Smokey. The ceiling caved in and disoriented the creature, giving Smokey time to rush behind it and get out of the door. Jesus Christ, Smokey yells. What the hell is that? That's Doc, Sheriff says as they run back into the remains of town. It can't be, Smokey returns. God, we burnt everything to the ground. There's nowhere to hide. It's Doc, all right, the sheriff says. Remember what he said. It could mutate a person, make them grow bigger like that. Doc smashed his way out of his office, bringing down the rest of the building and started making his way towards the guys. He doesn't have super speed or anything, but he's much faster than the other zombies. Buffalo shoots an arrow at Doc and it just bounces off. Any ideas? Smokey asks, seemingly preparing for their death. Yeah, actually, the sheriff says. We'll lead it into my house, I just need to stay ahead of it. They headed west out of town towards the sheriff's house. They kept a brisk pace ahead of Doc until sheriff's house is in sight and sheriff runs into his barn. The rest of the guys rush in behind him. "What's the plan?" Fish asks. Sheriff pulls out a stick of dynamite from the barrel in the barn. "I'm gonna blow him sky high. I've got 2 horses in the back there. You guys get them ready." So the guys take the horses out of the back while Sheriff waits for Doc. Doc seems to pick up the pace a little while Sheriff lights the dynamite. He drops the stick on the ground and hightails it out the back. He catches up with the guys behind a couple of trees, and they cover their ears as the stick explodes, destroying the barn and hopefully Doc too. And they come out from behind the trees to investigate. They see one of Doc's now massive arms sticking out from under a large pile of rubble. And they got him alright in that blast. They got him good. So everybody is standing there kind of relieved and Doc's arms begin moving. "Oh shit," Smokey says. Doc starts rustling even more as the rubble pile begins to move as well. "Anybody got anything else in mind?" And the sheriff asks. Doc is rising out of the pile by now. "Actually, I might have one," Smokey says. "That blast gave me an idea. The old silver mine a couple miles north." "Time to go," Fish says. Doc is back on his feet by this time and he seems to be regaining his bearings. They saddle up, 2 per horse, and start riding north. "We get to the mine, there's all kinds of TNT still in there," Smokey yells. "We bring the mountain down on his ass." "Good thinking," the sheriff hollers back, and they ride to the old mine, making sure that Doc stays behind them. I'm not sure if the blast pissed Doc off or if he was used to his new body now, but he's running full scale. If they hadn't been on horses, they would have been overtaken. They pick up the pace as the old mine comes into view. "I guess the question is," Smokey begins, "how do we get him in there and keep him in there long enough to blow the TNT and to have all of us get out safely?" "We don't," the sheriff says coldly. "Huh?" "We lead him in there, you guys get out the side tunnel. I stay and blow the mine," Sheriff explains. "No time to argue. Listen, I've got it in me. The sickness. Remember what he said. It all has to go." "But you could be immune," Smokey says. "Doc never ran the test. We don't know if I'm immune or a carrier. If I'm a carrier, I can still transmit it, even on accident. As long as I'm alive, this thing still exists." Smokey tried to argue some more, but Sheriff wouldn't have it. They all gather at the mine entrance as Doc comes barreling up. He picks up the pace when he sees them and he lets out a deafening roar. Smokey and the other guys run ahead and get the TNT ready. They make a huge pile and place a couple bundles strategically around all the exits. They lead the fuses back to the center of the room, where Sheriff will be able to quickly light them all. "You guys head on out," the sheriff says. They can hear echoing roars coming from the tunnels. "You guys need to make that mountain trail impassable. Whatever way you can, make it so people can't ever get up there again." They quickly say their tearful goodbyes and haul ass down the second tunnel. They're just about back outside when there's an ear-shaking, deafening explosion which knocks them to the ground. Smokey turns and sees the mines coming down on itself. Buffalo helps him to his feet and they get further from the entrance and clear off the dust. They check the main entrance as well as the last side tunnel to make sure that the mine is sealed off completely. Sheriff had brought down thousands of tons of rock down on himself and Doc. There's no way that Doc survived that one. The next day and over the next few weeks, Smokey, Buffalo, and Fish did what Sheriff said. They made the mountain trail impassable. They enlisted the help of a few others to get it done. But they did everything from chop down trees, to fall over the trail, to cutting down cacti and throwing them on the trail too, and to digging up the thorniest weeds and bushes they could find and replanting them on the trail. By just the next summer, it had become so overgrown that you would never know a trail had ever been there. Smokey also planted a large tombstone right at the head where the trail started, engraved with nothing but a skull and crossbones. And I guess that's the end of it. The small zombie outbreak was defeated and it appears they were successful. Almost 150 years later and no sign of any zombies out there. Now you're probably wondering about the evidence I mentioned right off the bat, about what's true about this story. There's a couple of things that support this event actually happening. First, according to family research, we think Smokey is my great-great-grandfather. My granddad did in fact go by the nickname Smokey, but we aren't able to identify if he's actually the Smokey from the story. And the second piece of evidence is the Doc's journal. Smokey kept it and it was still around as late as 1979, when it was lost in a house fire. My dad claims to have read some of it when he was a kid back in the 50s, and there were some passages about undead. The thing is, if it hadn't been lost in the fire, it would be pretty much illegible today, as it had deteriorated badly by that point. Thirdly, I have seen the skull and crossbones tombstone with my own eyes. It's very worn and deteriorated, but it's still there. It's a solid 8-mile hike from the nearest campground one way, and the trail isn't easy. But everybody in my family goes to see it at least once in their life. I walked into the woods a little bit beyond it and there's simply no going anywhere up there. It's too thick. The trash in the place and 150 years of unbrindled overgrowth sure did the trick. It's probably good. For all we know, that lake is still infected, and those zombified turtles are still scuttering around in the sand up there,